How does Europe as a whole get itself out of the hole that it's in? Technologies are like literally changing the game. You can't compete with even a mediocre engineer who has these tools. Why would any software development be done in a country that doesn't have access to these tools?
If you're not having equal access to AI, maybe this limits our ability to be competitive, the chance to be economic prosperous. Europe on edge. Welcome to a new episode of the podcast. Today we're going to talk with none other than Max Buckley. Max is an AI researcher and software engineer who spent more than 12 years at Google working on information retrieval, knowledge graphs, and large language models. More recently, he led knowledge research at Exa and helped build the company's Zurich office. Now, rumor has it that he's about to start his own company. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Max Buckley. Europe on edge. I'm very excited for you to be here. So let's start right away. What does Exa really do? And maybe for lay terms.
In layman terms. Yeah, so Exa is building a search engine for AI. So it's building internet, like web search for AI agents. And, you may already be using Exa but not be aware of it because oftentimes it's used as a sort of tool in the background, right? So when you use a chatbot, when you use something like Cursor, oftentimes, you'll ask a question like, build me a machine learning model, and then the AI agent may do a web search where it will search for PyTorch v2 documentation for a particular function or thing that you want to do. That web search can be powered by Exa. Some of them are. So Cursor, for example, is powered by Exa. And then that will retrieve the documentation. It might retrieve like technical blog posts, or white papers, depending on what you're looking for in the particular area you're working. And then that information is given to the generative model to help it ground its generations, make it more accurate and more timely, right? Because oftentimes these models are trained several months in advance, right? So they don't know what's happened since. They don't know about the latest changes to the APIs. They don't know about the latest white paper that shipped in May. So that's what Exa primarily does, is web search. But then they're also building a kind of bunch of more intelligence-powered features on top of basic web search, right? So it's not just like put in a query, get back 10 links. It could be put in a query, get back, an answer or a structured output, right? Where you want your output to be entities. Let's say you want to search over people. You don't just want like a random mixture of like Medium posts and LinkedIn pages and you want 10 people who are named Max who live in Zurich. Then that's what you'll get, a list of 10 people where each one is a different person. Which obviously is useful if you're trying to do something like recruitment, though I don't know why you'd want those people.
Sure, makes sense. Maybe just let's try to unpack this very slowly. So when you talk about agents, what exactly agents? You mentioned Cursor?
Yeah, well, so Cursor is one, I suppose, example of like a coding agent, like a kind of, when I say agent, I mean like an LLM in a loop, right? That you have an LLM which is given a task and it then can iterate many times, calling different tools until it completes its task or decides it has failed, and then it kind of returns control to the user, right? That could be like, build me a, machine learning pipeline in PyTorch, which the model may then decompose into, well, the first thing to do is to do some research, and the first part of research would be make a web search call to check like what's the latest PyTorch documentation, or maybe like find an example, right? It might find a blog post where someone has already done something like that and kind of template its approach off that.
Gotcha. So those agents, so basically what Exa does, please correct me if I'm putting it too simple out there, but you facilitates the access of the internet through, let's say, an LLM or an agent in its simplest form.
Exactly.
So why is it not easy to do straight away? Why does something needs to be done in order to improve LLMs to query certain things?
So, the models that you would use today already have, many of them will already have like a web search tool, right? Like if you use ChatGPT or Claude just through their web UI, occasionally you'll see it like searching the web and, it'll give you kind of a preview of what it's kind of doing and it'll get some results and you'll see the sort of inline citations. Similarly with Google and Gemini, same kind of deal. I guess why is that necessary in the general terms, right? Is because LLMs, while they are a compression of a large part of the internet, it's a sort of lossy compression. And so things that are like represented a lot of times in their training data is like well memorized, a bit like a human, right? If it's seen a lot of facts about Barack Obama, it knows about Barack Obama, right? In its training data, it may have seen mention of my name a few times, and it wasn't frequent enough and it wasn't weighted highly enough to be internalized accurately, right? So if it has to remember my date of birth, it will forget. It will be wrong, right? Whereas if it does a web search and finds, I don't know, some social media profile of mine that has my date of birth explicitly stated and set by me, it's very likely to be correct, right? Whereas it will already know Barack Obama's date of birth. So that's why you want to have a web search in general. Once you have web search, the question is, how was the web search optimized, right? So Google historically obviously is very much optimized for people. Right? When you're doing a Google search, it's showing you 10 results and you're clicking on one or more of them historically, though these days 0 clicks is becoming very common. But those clicks tell Google which was the right result for you, or like which was probably the right result for you. And so those click signals are used to optimize the results. But there's also the expectation that the human is doing, a human is quite a versatile unit. We don't know what they're doing. So there's a whole broad set of results, right? Like maybe, an agent might be very domain specific. Like a recruitment agent may only care about recruiting people. It like doesn't have feelings. It doesn't have shopping intent. It doesn't do other things, or it doesn't care about coding documentation. So, we can make it search much more specific for that domain. Similarly with a coding agent, we can reasonably assume that Claude Code or Cursor or Lovable or whatever, people are building applications in there. They don't necessarily care about some topics, and we can, as such, not surface those and or kind of focus more of our like retrieval and our compute on optimizing the results for those purposes.
Just before we get into this question a bit deeper, it seems kind of a very specific problem, or at least, I also been in machine learning, AI for a bit, and I didn't find that way right away. Maybe you did. So can you maybe explain how you get into this, let's say, knowledge retrieval kind of space or domain at large?
Yeah, it was also not particularly straightforward for me. So interestingly, I joined Google 13 years ago now as an intern, but I didn't join Google in information retrieval. I didn't join it in search. In fact, I didn't even join it in engineering or research. I joined it in the business side. I joined it as a financial analyst intern, which is unusual. I kind of took this very circuitous path through the company, moving from financial analyst to a business analyst under sales into their trust and safety, which is like a kind of like policy compliance stuff under legal. But that put me much closer to actual engineers who were working on kind of automated policy enforcement. So I joined their engineering team, spent a few years there, moved to shopping engineering, building a lot of like data processing infrastructure. But again, none of this is information retrieval. And then I moved from there basically into machine learning. So like traditional supervised learning, tree-based models, very much imbalanced learning for a product. Spent a year and a half there. And then during that time, ChatGPT appeared and kind of like the LLM AI hype began. And so my kind of decision while I was on that previous product was that once that went public, that I wanted to move to work on LLMs and AI. What was being rebranded as AI, which previously we called natural language processing. And so I joined an LLM AI like innovation team within Google's core infrastructure, and that team had a very broad like remit of like, well, figure out what we'll do with LLMs, like how do we generate some value for our part of the company, and that kind of became internal knowledge management, like internal information retrieval, kind of RAG type work. And that RAG type work kind of took me into making a different team focus on the same kind of problems and into this sort of knowledge graph space. And then Exa kind of saw what I was up to and contacted me, and that's how I ended up coming in here.
Those are kind of intricate details when you talk about natural language processing. Did you build up those skills completely just on your own by trial and error and the knowledge of the web, or did you?
A bit of both. My bachelor degree is in business studies.
Okay.
Hence why I became a financial analyst intern and business analyst. But like in parallel to that, I did learn to program as a kid and built a bunch of applications. So
you knew how to program already?
Yeah.
Okay.
But I didn't know how to do software engineering. Like I knew how to make something work. I didn't know how to make it like that it would get past code review. So my first code reviews were hilarious. 170 comments on like, probably 70 lines. But then when I was actually at Google, I did a lot of part-time study. I did 4 part-time postgraduate programs. I did a stats program, I did a master's in business analytics, I did a master's in software engineering, and then I came to ETH to do the diploma in data science.
Okay.
It's a DAS here, so that was amazing, a particular highlight. But that was all in parallel to me doing like a lot of like Coursera's and reading a lot and just exploring myself.
It's okay. Okay, so you took courses, you tried to build yourself, and
Yeah.
today you're top of the heap, we may say here. Okay. But it's fair to say that what drawn you to this domain was the success of large language models, essentially, or is that like you could see the applications clear cut?
Well, it's funny. So in 2017, end of 2017, I was finishing like my master's in business analytics, and for that, my master's thesis was on kind of natural language processing. So I was doing kind of predicting salaries from job listings. So you're working on
already
kind of
okay. Mm-hmm.
text representations, and I didn't read the transform paper when it first landed, but like I was training like RNNs back then, and like I was amazed by the generative capabilities, how you could train them on like 1 million job listings, and then they would generate like not whole job listings, but like sentences that look credible, And I was like, what? So I then kind of moved away from NLP a bit for like the few years, focused on other areas like operations research. But then obviously with ChatGPT, it suddenly made it very salient, and I kind of came back to my previous fancy.
I can get how you could get excited about those technologies. Okay, I got your way into LLMs and so forth, and but maybe moving on from Google, where you built up and learned all your skills, and as you described, you were rather at the beginning, right? You tried to find internal use cases, I guess, for the company. How did this connect then to Exa? And you went on, and I think that's the very exciting part, to build, the Exa's office here in Zurich. So maybe you can give a bit about the insight, how this converged to this.
Yeah, so it's
business.
I mean, kind of makes sense, and it's also kind of mysterious at the same time. So because I like got joined this LLM AI innovation team at Google, obviously I was like learning about the various pieces, right? So I was one of the employees that showed some of the early value of like long context models, like basically just brute force putting a lot of stuff in the context, answering questions, right? That worked, but it took like several minutes, and obviously it was costly because you were burning like hundreds of thousands of tokens to like answer a small question. So then me and the team went into this sort of RAG based approaches, right? And of course, the second you go into RAG with any level of depth, you go into like vector databases, right?
Mm-hmm.
So again, just from doing this, I was like, okay.
Can you maybe briefly give an intuition why that's the case? Why we need to go into databases or vector databases after?
Yeah. So I guess for people who aren't as like obsessive as me, so RAG stands for Retrieval Augmented Generation, and the idea of this is that you do some kind of like search or query to get a set of data, and then you put that data in the context window of the model, right? So suddenly someone asks a question like, when was Barack Obama born? And instead of just having the model generate an answer from its internalized knowledge, you do a web search, for example, or search your database and find that Barack Obama Wikipedia page. You put that in the context window, and then the model has to answer the same question. And now it can basically just look back at the actual Wikipedia page. It can see where his date of birth is listed, and it can basically just copy that string from there to there, right? And when you do this, it makes the model a lot more accurate. It also allows you to do nice things like change the data rather than having to rely on the internalized knowledge, right? Like in theory, if you give it like the wrong date of birth or a different date of birth or a different Barack Obama, it can tolerate this a bit better than the kind of naive approach. But once you decide to go down that direction, once you say, okay, let's explore RAG, the question is, what is the kind of search backend that's going to service your RAG system? And the very popular one for most people, probably what they think of as the default, is to do what's called semantic search. And what semantic search is that you use what's called an embedding model to map your queries into a fixed length numerical vector. And you also do the same offline with all of your documents or pieces of documents. And then when a query comes in, you just search from this query, what are the closest points in your like document space? And you put those in the context window for the model. So the model might be getting, say, the 5 closest points. Hopefully one of them is the date of birth of Barack Obama. And usually it is. It works very well. And if you do this in a small company or for like a personal project, you probably won't have to look into vector search in any degree of detail because, probably your personal project has like 10,000 rows or 100,000 rows. obviously we were building like internal knowledge management system for Google. So we were indexing tens of millions from like of documents from no time at all, right? And then later hundreds of millions. So you do need to be aware of how vector search works, how to optimize it, where it fails. And so that's what took me to.
Because as far as I understand, the scale is really one of the critical problems to solve if
Yes.
you want to use the sort of technology. Is that correct? And if you're basically saying here that you managed to already worked out solution within a big company like Google, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like, so to like one of the points where people often struggle with RAG, right, is this kind of going to production step, right? This idea that you show that it worked well on your like 30,000 rows, and then you dump in like 10 million, and suddenly it takes like several minutes to return, and the quality goes down, and you're like, oh no, this is not good. And again, this can be prevented if you know what to do, or if you do things in a sort of scalable way. And again, there are books on this. There's lots of papers on things on this. So I didn't invent these things either.
Sure.
Good ideas existed. But what's interesting is basically I got a book on vector search, and I read this book. And I actually, when I read books, sometimes I like annotate them. I get a highlighter, a bit like your pages here. I leave little kind of like notes to myself, future self, or like And so then I was in hospital like 2 weeks later for like a minor surgery, and I had nothing to do because I'm in hospital. But I had the book with me, and it was all highlighted. So I decided to type up my feedback and email it to the author, who I don't know.
Okay. How did that work?
Well, so it worked very well. So basically, I emailed this guy, like just 10 pages of feedback.
Do we know the author? Do you
Yeah,
know the
Sebastian
name?
Bruch. Yeah, he was a professor at Northeastern University until recently.
Okay.
Like a senior researcher there. He used to be like a principal scientist at Pinecone, like very expert in information retrieval, like really awesome guy. But I didn't know him anyway. So I sent him like 10 pages of feedback and an email attached to it, saying here. And like the feedback was really granular. This was not like me being opinionated about like nonsense. This was like, you should add an extra line to this proof where you break out these 2 steps into one by one. It'll make it easier to follow, define this before first use, move this here, like
This
typo on this page.
1 week at the hospital. Really?
Just a day at the hospital.
A day out.
Yeah, 1 day at the hospital. So I emailed this guy, and then a few weeks later he emails me back, says like acknowledged, and I was like, okay. And then a few
What sentence?
Yeah, a few weeks later he emails me back again, being like, oh my god, I just looked at the feedback, it's amazing, thank you so much, it's basically a second edition, blah blah. And I'm like, cool. And then a few years later, like end of last year, he emails me out of the blue. I haven't talked to him. I still hadn't talked to him.
Okay.
He emails me and says, hey, I'm an advisor to the startup Exa, and they're looking to expand. They're like, he told me a bit about them, and they asked me who they should hire, and I said you. And I'm like, amazing, honored, blown away. So, I got on a call with the CEO, and I sort of pitched to him a Zurich office, and I kind of said that like this ETH here, with amazing talent. There's a giant Google office. There's like medium-sized offices from like Meta, Nvidia, small offices from Anthropic, OpenAI. It's a great ecosystem growing here. And I said like, I'm not like interested to be some remote guy. Like, let's get an office. Let's get like a handful of people. Let's build a team here. And it took about 6 months, but I convinced him.
Okay. So from comments in the margins, like some famous French mathematician, right? You basically went on to connect or like to be called or by this professor, and essentially you got this position at Exa.
Yep.
And then very exciting. So maybe you basically try to tell them, okay, there's a great network here in Zurich. There's a lot of possibilities to connect. Maybe you can elaborate on that, on how you were able to sell the case, because I don't know when this happened. This was maybe...
So this started in August of last year.
August last year.
And, it was ongoing until January of this year when it was, I think, sealed the deal. And so at first it was like, my very first call with the CEO, I'm like, he rings me, he's like, hey, would you be interested in joining the team, moving to San Francisco? And I'm like, how about a Zurich office and, a handful of engineers, researchers working here, And he was like, I think like, what? Who's this guy, crazy cowboy? I that night immediately sent him like a handful of really strong candidates who I knew, my friends who I thought were really relevant, which I'm sure was like, okay, these are really strong profiles. These are the kind of people that we want. We had a few more conversations over the coming kind of weeks. We did formal like tech interviews with them. Communication kind of dropped off in November, so I kind of thought maybe we had kind of lost it, that they were like trying to hurry us along. And, we had a bunch of other work travel and things with Google and conferences and things. But then at NeurIPS in San Diego last year, I was there, they were there. I didn't know they were there. I had emailed the CEO, but he didn't respond that he was going to be there. But I just saw that there was like a boat party for Exa. And I messaged one of the marketing women who was organizing it. I said, hey, can me and these other people come? And she was like, well, she didn't respond. The CEO responded. He's like, yeah, of course, you're in, see you there. And I was like, cool. So I went to the boat party. We chatted a bit. Then randomly I met him just around San Diego. We had dinner together a few times. We talked, I met him in San Francisco. We talked more. And I still didn't think this was going to happen, right? Even though I visited the office, because it's still a big ask, right? To ask someone to invest millions of dollars in a foreign country, especially when you don't, your knowledge, your relationship with them is that you've only met them a handful of times. But then just before Christmas, we had a call. I was in Ireland for Christmas with my family.
Okay.
And he basically tells me on the phone that him and the team are going to come to Zurich in January and like scope it out for real. And so I immediately got onto like the canton of Zurich and like the greater Zurich area and like about foreign direct investment, and like they wheeled out all sorts of like awesome resources and people to help connect the dots. They offered like office space, all these amazing support services. They put us in contact with like the founder of Anthropic Zurich and Palantir Zurich and a bunch of other really useful people, and it was amazing. So I was able to kind of give the CEO like, not only, am I like a solid, credible engineer / researcher, I'm also quite agentic and just get things done. Like, he's coming to visit. I'm like, here's free office space and accountants and lawyers and, professors from EPFL and ETH and, you know what I mean? It's like, I'm sure he was thinking, okay, maybe this guy's got some crazy ideas.
Yeah, so sounds good. Sounds very exciting. Of course, you were able to sell yourself. But just to add back, and I heard these comments quite a bit now. How do you assess? I think talent in the US maybe versus talent in Europe. I think there is differences in how talent gets acquired, right? Can you maybe comment a little bit on this? And I think I just talked briefly on a similar topic. And so there seems to be that, sometimes there's quite a battle for talent in the US going on. So people are hired or, for a large amount of money and things like that. And, in Europe, things are maybe different. People like to be like located in one spot and therefore you have like certain maybe advantages to attract them.
It's definitely true that people in the US seem to move around a lot more. And I think that partially makes sense in the sense that maybe there are less barriers to moving around. Like effectively in Europe, every country is like, every major city falls in a different country, right? With a different potentially language, legal system, set of bureaucracy that you need to wade through, right? So like, it's not the case that you're as likely to just move city, if it means also moving country and, re-registering and transferring your pensions and all of these other fun things. But also, yes, there is such a much more competition. In Zurich, for example, I've been here now since 2018, so 8 years. But for most of my time, Google basically was like the whale in the sort of tech space here, right? That there was no, more recently there's more of a kind of growth of the smaller other companies, but you were in Google, you were kind of there. There wasn't really many other things biting nipping at your heels or whatever else. Whereas there's just so many companies, right? And it's not just the really big ones. It's even the smaller ones there are much more kind of competitive and sort of credible. And I think as well, compensation is something that I think can't be not mentioned. One of my feelings is that with Europe, compensation is very much dependent on the city that you are based in. That if you're going from Zurich to basically anywhere else, you're going to take a pay cut unless you become 5 levels higher. You know what I mean? Which doesn't make any sense coherently. If you're developing a global product, whatever.
Yeah, that's definitely the case. The wages in Switzerland are definitely higher, maybe of the neighboring countries like that, but that's not the case in comparison to the Silicon Valley. Right?
Oh yes, but I say it also is not too much the case in the US, right? If you're in San Francisco and someone in New York wants you, they will just pay you more money than that. Whereas if you are in Zurich and the only place that maybe you can find some jobs that pay you more is London. And again, that's maybe some. There's multiple kind of diminishing quantifiers on that statement. If you're willing to move to high frequency trading, you can make more money in London. That's a snippet moment. Whereas as an example, like Google pays like hugely more in Zurich than it pays in Dublin or Germany or, I mean, Italy or whatever, UK. You know what I mean? So interesting, right? Like,
So there's definitely some attractivity for the Zurich standpoint, the Zurich place, and you were able to leverage this. Of course, you were very industrious in yourself, so and make that happen, which is very exciting. So you've been working before already here, so you had already a connection, and you wanted to stay, I guess.
yeah.
Great. So you build up this lab, you move on to Exa, but we haven't, you probably wanted to work at Exa not just because you like Zurich so much, so or make it happen in Zurich. So there's maybe some critical challenges that attracted you right away, or especially today, where
Like, what else did I like about Exa, I suppose, is the question.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I first discovered Exa in like August of last year, as I mentioned. And like from the moment I heard about it from that email from this Sebastian, I immediately started like doing my due diligence, right? So that was on a Thursday or Friday. So I spent the weekend like watching several interviews with the CEO of Exa. I watched, I read various blog posts that they had put out and whatever else. And like,
what you were looking for, actually?
I was looking for like, is this somewhere that I actually am interested in? Like, because I mean, I don't want to waste anyone's time, right? I didn't want to go in and pitch them an office if they're gonna say, like, if it didn't make sense, if I didn't want to work there, if I didn't like the sort of the feeling that I liked the CEO who would ultimately be my boss, right? And that I didn't, if it didn't make sense, I didn't want to go down that.
But you get this email from this professor, this established
this was just said, I'm going to introduce you to this like CEO, and and like you can have a call with him or whatever else. And I'm like, cool. So then I'm like,
Then you start working through the weekend to figure out
who he is, what it is, like what makes sense, And like I immediately liked their area. I mean, effectively building a search engine for AI is effectively what RAG is, but it's on a global web scale, right? Also the company had a lot of the right sort of signals. Like, so when I looked at it last summer, like they had a valuation of 700 million, which since I joined has grown to like 2.2 billion. So that's amazing.
Wow.
They're a YC startup from 5 years ago, right? So they're like, in that kind of cool class of startups, and they're obviously an SF based sort of high growth startup. So it lets me get kind of exposure to all of that learning and experience and seeing how things are done over there. How are things done differently? I mean, even though I was at Google for like 12 or whatever years, I joined in 2013, right? Where the company was already like established and dominant, right? Like it was already like the global powerhouse, what I mean? And we're just
position one, right?
Incrementally growing it, right? Whereas, now I'm effectively in like a scale up, right? A company that's like aggressively growing, aggressively expanding. It's like
much bigger challenges,
just it's a very different experience. And that's something that I wanted, because I think that like all of these learnings are useful for like the future, right? If I want to found my own startup, it's good to spend some time in a really promising high growth startup, scale up, and learn what works, what doesn't work. I mean, I knew there would be challenges. Like I knew that obviously like working across time zones is never easy. And of course, at a company like Google, it's a bit easier in the sense that it's such an established thing, right? Like, you're not the first international office, you're the 19th, you know what I mean? If even, or rather like in Zurich, you're the like 6,000th employee in a giant 15 building complex of people, right? So even though you're working in an international company, maybe you don't even deal with people outside of your time zone much, But here, obviously, we work very closely with the US, so we do have meetings until kind of 7:15, 7:45 most days,
So, okay, they gave you some uncharted territory, something to discover, something to build up. Of course, that makes sense. You did your due diligence. You liked what they did. Of course, the fit is amazing, right? You've been working on those vector databases. So my question still, in your heart somewhere, there's like this little piece that you call yourself an engineer. So in the end of the days, we like to think about, solving some problems or trying to work something very technical. And those challenges are maybe the ones that drive you. I'm not sure. You feel free. I don't want to put words in your mouth. So what are you working on today? What is really at heart that you're trying to fix and trying to build?
I mean, we're building all sorts of things. I mean, today, a lot of what our team is focusing on is like query understanding, right? So when a query comes in, like what can we almost instantly extract from it to kind of route to our different backends to kind of make sure we retrieve the right information. But we're also doing kind of like research into kind of named entity recognition, trying to improve things there, and also into actual vector search, right? So we're actually looking a lot into kind of accelerated vector search. So like how can we efficiently do like filtered vector search on GPUs effectively. So there's a lot of different like niche things. I do find that actually, interestingly, I feel like coding agents have kind of really disrupted this space a bit. Like, I mean, I really appreciate them, but I also kind of like lamented it a little bit in the sense that like, it's funny, right? When I was in Google previously, I worked on this a machine learning product, and at one point I noticed it was like not deterministic, right? Like, and I spent weeks, months even, making it fully deterministic, right? That you set the seed and you get exactly the same results, right? Amazing.
With an agent?
No. This previously. This is back in the old world of 2022, 2021.
The old world is funny.
Right? And it's funny, right? Because this took weeks or months, and like it was a very good project, very celebrated, like leadership management. People loved it. It was like I won a little award, thing Google. Recently, I had a very similar thing in Exa where I was like, hey, this is not deterministic. And I just told the agent, and it went off spinning for about 4 hours, like trying different things, making different patches, rerunning the evals, failing, doing refailing, failing. After about 4 hours, basically after lunchtime, it returned and it was like, oh, there's just one line missing here, sync threads, and this fixes it. And I'm like, amazing. So I basically wrote one paragraph and then I like left that thread alone, and 4 hours later I'm like, there's the solution. You send out this one line fix, Took longer to like merge it than to actually like for me to write the spec, right?
I mean, it's exciting that very particular that it just required one line to be fixed.
Yes. It was literally just a missing sync threads in one place. Okay. I mean, in Google case that was a different issue, but
okay.
But it was still a very minor fix. Ultimately, at the end, it was like
you didn't get an award for this one.
No. I feel like the agent deserves the award. We'll give it to Opus 4.8.
Okay, but just maybe to linger it a bit more, you mentioned this. You're still basically debating yourself, like many of us are. There are pros and there are cons of using those agents, or and how you work with them today. But so, what would you say are the things that you're most exciting about using agent, or the advantages that you benefit or reap, and what are the things that you're most concerned about using agent?
I mean, I feel like
coding agent.
Yeah. So even though I use them every day, all day, including my days off, like I still feel like my mental model is very rapidly evolving, right? Like how to best use these things, like I'm still very much learning. Like, I mean, it's amazing that you can basically just focus on the level of like problems and what you want to get done, and not like this level of like syntax and, details. Like it's really amazing that like ideas that you've had for years that you didn't do because it would take 3 months, you spend like 20 minutes writing it up and throw it in the model, and bada bing, bada boom, you have it in an hour. So that's kind of incredible, right? It really constantly just shocks me how easy it is. Like finding this determinism issue was like trivial, or, I even had the other experience of like building things that again took me 6 weeks in Google in like 1 or 2 prompts. Now again, probably took me like 10 minutes split over 2 prompts, right? Okay, I'm juggling 10 other things, but it's amazing, right? Like what does the world look like when we can have infinite custom software, right? Where like, you're making a podcast here and you could have your own custom software for editing. You don't have to rely on something from Apple or whoever else, right? I personally have started taking a learning diary at home where I just record like some voice notes, like literally in blah, blah, chat for 10 minutes into my microphone. And then it records it and it sends it off, transcribes it with Whisper, and then sends it to Claude, gets it summarized into like bullet points, and then it like uploads it into my little learning diary. And it's like custom software just for me. Like no one else in the world has this. It's just like, this would never make sense in the old world, right? Whereas now it's just like some piece of my daily process. And like, I mean, it saved me the kind of hassle of like recording it in the studio app and then running Whisper from the CLI on the like generated video file and then copy pasting, it's just saving a few steps, but it's just like,
you can make software developing something for everybody. It's like taking notes essentially now.
Yes, exactly. And it's insane. It's absolutely crazy. And I think that we're almost like much more limited by ideas now than by implementation. Whereas before it was the other way around. Before it was like, we just don't like, we've created these structures in companies where we have like layers of management and program managers and project managers, and their entire job is to distill many ideas into few. Whereas I listened to an interview at the weekend, and basically the guy was saying that like recently they had a quarter where their backlog shrank, not grew, and it was the first time in the company's history. They did more things than people requested. You know what I mean? Like for the
Yeah,
first
it's
time
kind of-
ever. And I mean, that's insane, right? That like before, people were like, oh, this would be cool, that'd be cool. And you're like, well, we can only do 20 of these things. So
You have to prioritize this backlog
Yeah,
list,
yeah.
how many of those tasks you will really implement.
yeah.
And that is really, sounds amazing. Yeah.
Like we did like quarterly planning because things took quarters to make, right? Now we need to almost do like daily planning or like weekly planning. And like, it's funny, Claude, or I guess other models as well, they still give you the old world time estimates. Like Claude will literally tell you what this would have taken last November. Like Claude will say, oh, this is a very good research project. This will take about 12 weeks. And then you copy and paste it into Claude code and 20 minutes later, it's like, it's done. And you're like, that's a good 12 weeks, Claude.
Yeah. So the speed, you're saying that the speed of things, I mean, what about like the I don't want to linger too much on the negative things, but maybe we should uncover them a little bit. I mean, back in the day when I asked, a developer develop something, he could tell me anything about the code. So line by line, essentially, they would know exactly what kind of problems they encountered and solved. I guess now, if you talk to somebody which used an agent before, this person doesn't probably know anything, not in detail what happened line by line.
Yeah. I mean, that's absolutely true.
How do you solve this?
I mean, but the thing is,
Does it need solving?
well, that's the thing. It would be impossible to learn and understand it at the speed it's coming in now, right? Like if you think about it, the code base, even if you had a big code base, like even when you're like a senior engineer on like a big project that's hundreds of thousands of lines of code, that hundreds of thousands of lines was laid down over several years, right? And you either wrote those lines yourself manually, slowly, or you reviewed those lines for your colleague, or maybe you've like just read them when you were debugging a particular issue, right? You've basically seen all the code at least once and different parts of it to different degrees, right? Whereas now you could just send out a pull request that's like 10,000 lines, boom. And that's just one of the 4 pull requests you landed before lunch. That was also 10,000 lines. Like, you cannot possibly read and fully understand this. So I guess what you need to go with is other methods of verification. Where possible, you have, things that you can actually use yourself and kind of verify that they work, or you have like tests, or you have some kind of oracle. So I like, which again, and I mean, I can say why someone might argue the point, well, maybe, you just took the happy path and you didn't realize the edge case, or maybe, your unit tests don't cover the negative numbers, or you obviously you can find fault with this argument. And I mean, obviously this is not like something I would say to apply to like a pacemaker software. I wouldn't just be YOLO shipping things there. But, for some areas it is, I mean, it's incredible. Like, one interesting example which I mentioned is like, so this time last year, a little bit earlier last year, like February of last year, KernelBench came out as a paper and it showed that frontier models at the time, so O1 and DeepSeek's OR1, basically got like 20% of KernelBench. It couldn't write efficient GPU code, right? As of today, with like even not Fable, but Opus 4.8 can like score like almost 100% on the lower levels and like 90% on the highest levels, and can write really efficient kernels. So like I had this experience recently with a friend of mine where he's made a fork of this open source popular repo called LikeGBM, a gradient boosted tree. And so I basically gave Claude the task. I said, like, I want you to like do some hyperparameter search and like compare a bunch of hyperparameters, the CPU version versus the CUDA implementation. And if there's a difference in the output, isolate the source of difference and give me a fix, and put them all on their own branches and make pull requests, right? And I let it run overnight, right? So I ran on my like local machine, like 5090, just churning through different hyperparameters, finding all sorts of bugs, fixing all sorts of bugs. And I have like 10 PRs in the morning, and I checked through them all manually, and they all look fantastic and good. And it's like hilarious, right? Like, this is a library that's been used by thousands, tens of thousands of people for a long period of time. And okay, the CUDA isn't as mature as the other implementations, but the fact that you can just do that when you have that nice oracle is crazy, right? That you have like...
So it also allude also to the speed of this development and the progression of those models. Okay, I understand. You can do much more. Things are much faster. These can also be done completely automatic, as you say, without you checking them. And when you check them, you are even convinced of their quality, which is just amazing. Didn't used to be. But are there like new problems which arise through the use of these tools, which were not there maybe before?
Well, I mean, I think really this shows the problems that already existed, or like the bottleneck in the system moves, right? Like, for example, previously people thought that they had an idea for a startup, but the hard part would be getting an engineer and getting them to spend 3 or 6 months in a cave building their idea before they could like tackle the next problem, which would be like go to market or getting investors. Now you can build your idea in 20 minutes, and then you realize now the problem is getting customers or going to market, or like, getting investors, right? So you've just realized the problems sooner. And I think on a macro level, once everyone has these tools, the level of competition is going to go way up, right? Because before, like if you had convinced some engineer to spend 6 months building your like whatever, your little web app, right? You had a little moat, right? Which is that it took a half decent engineer 6 months to build it. Whereas now it took 20 minutes. So anybody can see your web app and say, Claude, build me my own version of that, please. Thanks.
But this is provided that you have access to this tool.
Well, that's yes, depending on the version of Claude. If you've made a Fable app and I just can't duplicate it with Opus,
Yeah, so maybe we just mentioned about that. So today is, let me see, not saying something badly here. Today is June 15. And so Fable released, which is the latest model of Anthropic. And so they banned the users. I think there was kind of a couple of updates. Maybe you like to mention, which limit its applicability or application for users.
Yeah. So Fable was released, I think, last week, and it was basically Mythos with additional guardrails, and the guardrails were to specifically limit its capabilities in certain areas Anthropic deemed sensitive. So this was like biological research because it could be used for sort of chemical weapons or biological weapons. They also had guardrails around AI development because they don't want competitors building competition, and a few other sensitive spaces. And effectively what the guardrails did was made it fall back to Opus 4.8. So it was still not going to be terrible, but like not the best anymore. And it was available for a few days. And then on this like Friday US time, and there was like an announcement made that the US government had ordered them to like make it available only to US nationals or something. And this obviously for Europeans, I woke up to this on Saturday morning that Fable is no longer available for anybody in the world right now, I think, because they don't know how to limit it to US nationals yet. So they're just locking it down for everyone, which is super interesting.
Yeah, well, it's super interesting to say the least. I mean, before we talk about the downstream consequences about this and maybe how we need to think about this in general as Europeans and so forth, what's your feeling about this strategy? Does this strategy sort of make sense? Or, is that something that we should, is it just a first step of an AI company and the other companies will follow eventually?
I worry that other companies will follow suit, right? Like that, a bit like we saw AI research kind of like really getting hamstrung in 2022. I think that possibly we're going to see more and more efforts for the leading labs to sort of prevent fast followers, right? Which is kind of disappointing, right? Because again, these guardrails at least are like too broad in general, right? Like if you like even before the US government gets involved, just the fact that like AI research can be kind of defined as, you writing any GPU code or you doing machine learning, right? Which obviously isn't necessarily frontier AI research, but if you want to make the guardrail relatively broad and robust, you need to say, okay, if this topic is getting flagged by our classifier, route to Opus. In terms of like the other thing here is like, so that there was announcements from Anthropic that like with the newest models, I think that they said that 80% of its code was written by Claude, up from like 20% like a year ago or something. And this kind of follows with kind of what I was saying earlier, right? So they're like, last year, the frontier models couldn't effectively write kernels effectively, right? Like the 20% or so was the success rate at KernelBench. Now it's, let's say, 100-ish. So, you literally could ask O1 to write you a CUDA kernel. It would not work. It might look nice, but it wouldn't work. Now it will work, and it'll likely work very well. And especially when you have a good harness like Claude Code, then it can kind of iterate, right? It can write the kernel. It tries to run it. It fails. It makes some changes, it runs it again, it succeeds. If you give it this kind of ability to do correctness checks, right? So that it says, is my kernel outputting the same as the previous kernel? Yes. Is it faster? And again, it can do, n equals 30, replications, and it can, do some statistical testing. And then it can say, yes, it is statistically significantly faster. And it's correct for, the 100 different inputs we tried. Let's assume it's true and, use this kernel. So this obviously is very useful to make the model faster, more resource efficient. And again, it's just iterating. It's just accelerating the whole process, right? These advantages kind of can compound or whatever else. And again, this is partially, I guess, why they're locking it down. And also partially where the risk is for Europe or something. That if we don't have access to the best models, then we can't necessarily write the most efficient code or even the most secure code. I mean, I think Mythos's proclaimed cybersecurity capabilities are exactly the same end result, right? Like, we created some sort of cyber gym where the model has to do all sorts of like cyber attacks and hacking and, defending and detecting attackers or whatever else. And all of those gyms, these are like reinforcement learning environments, are used. The model is being like rewarded if it successfully attacks the thing, successfully like breaks the system, or penalized if it fails. This makes the model really good at cybersecurity, right? So it's the same kind of mechanism, which is this RL training, just with different sort of sets of gyms, and just has this interesting downstream consequence or effect.
I mean, essentially, I understand that they try to limit they don't want others to compete with their own model. And, if you try to build better, let's say, coding agents with those models that they put out, of course, is shooting themselves in the foot. I think it was kind of geopolitically kind of interesting that they started limiting this for, where I said, this is kind of like the first movement, which, makes me also fear that we need to do something ourselves.
It is certainly the first movement on this level, on this kind of, or at least the first I'm aware of, like on the model level. But there was also a movement under Joe Biden where he wanted to restrict GPU sales to countries. I remember he had this like color coding of different countries. And it was a bit, I think people in Europe were a bit kind of surprised by some of the color coding. I think like Poland, for example, was in like the tier 2, and so was Switzerland, I believe, in this like orange zone, so which was sort of limiting how many GPUs you could buy or whatever else. And again, so it's like, I suppose, as I'm aware, the first limitation specifically on a named kind of model, but it's not the first like restriction on the sort of AI supply chain, I suppose.
Before we continue, a quick word for all students and recent graduates in Switzerland. University teaches you a lot, but some of the most valuable experience comes from actually putting that knowledge into practice. That's where ETH Juniors comes in. Earn money while gaining hands-on experience to real projects, flexible part-time roles, and full-time opportunities with startups, SMEs, and companies like Siemens, UBS, Novartis, and Accenture. Join the ETH Juniors talent pool for free in under 2 minutes and get matched with opportunities that fit your skills. Head to the ETH Juniors website to sign up and start building your experience, network, and career before you really need them. Now, let's get back to the conversation. That I understand. But if when you hear those, I mean, should the alarming bells go off? And, because in the end of the day, I mean, the downstream consequence, to put it bluntly, if we are not having equal access to AI, essentially these are the AI stack, if you want, then maybe this limits our ability to be competitive. And that's, how, and then the chance to be economic prosperous. So the question is here, what should we do? How should we consider this, and how should we interpret this going forward? I mean, I understand, of course, I cannot maybe develop as efficient code, as good code in a very particular area, but still, we don't know what the future is going to bring.
Yeah, no, I definitely think that makes sense. Like, I definitely think that, these technologies are like literally changing the game that we're playing, right? In the old world, like if you could write a few hundred lines of good code a day, you were a good engineer. Whereas now a good engineer can write hundreds of thousands with these tools, right? So like even if you are the old world good engineer who can write a few hundred a day and has like you can't compete with even a mediocre engineer who has these tools, right? And of course, if that slices geographically, like why would any software development be done in a country that doesn't have access to these tools? It doesn't make any sense, right? Like literally you could have like a small handful of people in a country that has the best tools building all the software or much of the software for the world, right? So the interesting question will be like, will open source be able to sort of help fill this gap? Or like will those also be kind of restricted, right? I mean, there has also been some shifts, if I understand, from Chinese labs, right? That some of the recent Quen models, I think, were released through the API first, if not only. So I don't know if they're going to continue on the beautiful benevolent path of open weighting everything. I hope they do, but
What's your take? Should machine learning models, should those models be open source? Should we have an open source culture in general? Do you think this is beneficial?
I mean, honestly, yes. I mean, yes, I hope so. I mean, I'm not someone who worries, but I find the state of the world or the way we're going very interesting right now. Like, I don't know where, like, if you asked me 7 months ago, before November, I had a very different worldview to what I have now, which is unusual. Probably for most of my life, it was relatively consistent. But I think that like Opus 4.5 completely disrupted the sort of software industry. Like there's before Opus 4.5 and there's after, right? Where I don't know what software engineering will look like in a few years, or, I don't even know whether it makes sense to found a sort of traditional software company now, because, I mean, on the one hand, yes, you can just build loads of software really quickly. But on the flip side, most of your competitors can do the same, and possibly, it really is. It's a much harder sell to me as someone who is a software engineer, right, for many years. So like it is interesting to know, like, where is this going? I have no clue. Like, I mean, if things go the way they're going, like if Anthropic or whoever gets the AGI, the hype or whatever, first, I mean, what does that mean? Like, they are already, like, I think I listened to an interview with Dario, and he claimed that their revenue had grown this year 80x. Right? I mean,
wow, it's like crazy to imagine.
They're about to, like, IPO for $1 trillion, which, okay, second $1 trillion IPO of the year, which is bigger than any company in Europe ever.
Yeah.
Like, it does strike me that this is, I mean, I was kind of expecting a kind of AI crash last year, until
the bubble to blow
up. 4.5. But now I actually think it makes sense. Like if like the Googles and the Microsofts and whatever can be $1 trillion companies on software, and this company can generate infinite software in no time, then it makes sense that the company could be worth crazy amounts of money, right? Like the reason they've grown 80x in a year is because literally every company that does software development has realized that just give a handful of good engineers these tools and they can replace your whole IT department, or you can have like 100x IT development. You can build all the products you thought you ever wanted, right?
Sure. I mean, but the question is, like any kind of technology, the technology development model, if you want, this S curve, essentially, technology gets to the point where it saturates, it starts to be good enough. And then
yeah,
that would mean the same thing for AI, right? At least, let's say on this LLM agent kind of level, we just saturate. We get it that's the best that it works. We just have incremental improvement from there on. So we need to work on other technologies, and then maybe new starts coming into the field. Are you trying to do this? Are you more of the same, so to speak, and they don't get away for the same amounts of money, let's say? So this could still happen, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's possible, right? I mean, like, it's possible that, like, let's say Mythos was the best ever, like that they never got any better than that. But I still think, like, there's a kind of a diffusion effect, right? I think that it still is going to take time to kind of diffuse across society. Like, I think that we haven't seen the wave of, like, crazy software development that is coming,
You still yeah, that's very exciting. Now, let's just flesh that out. What you mean exactly by this, the wave?
Like, I mean that, like, apparently on Apple's App Store, there's now twice as many apps being uploaded as last year. So twice as many people are, like, building apps, or, they're shipping twice as many apps. Now, saying that, there's even more concentration of people just using the top few apps. So, like, almost all the usage on iOS is on, like, the top few percent. But there's twice as many apps being shipped, right? People are having ideas and saying, I want to build an iOS app that, like, lets me track my workouts and does whatever. And, boom, you have it, right? And you can push it, like, the Apple Store, and people can buy it or use it for free, whatever. Say companies like, even look at Anthropic themselves, right? They're shipping so frequently. We've gone from the frontier model landing like once a year to twice a year to every month-ish. Like, we had Opus 4.8 and then we had Mythos a month later, and we had 4.7 a month before that, we had 4.6 a month before that, and we had 4.5 like 2-3 months before that. And that's obviously interleaved with, like, Claude Code updates and whatever else they're shipping. This is, I think, that kind of just acceleration of software development, right? And, like, the better the model gets, the less time you have to put into, like, review and whatever else, right? Like, if Mythos says it's good, probably good.
Yeah.
If Opus 4.8 said it's good, it's like 5% maybe bad. But, like, I don't know, and you just scale from there. But so I think there's this wave of, like, incoming software.
So you're basically saying a little bit like, okay, this has not penetrated the whole of society.
Oh,
It will.
absolutely not.
And so you expect a lot of more people getting into software development essentially, and these people all making use of these companies' tools, so they will grow even in revenue. So it's still moving on. It's still growing up. So I mean, what I'm more concerned is like, okay, we are growing people which can use tools or AI tools, coding, whatever, but not necessarily the people which are really using, making benefit of the, or you develop an app. Who's going to use that app? It's not necessarily growing. I understand that it's growing the people which want to use AI tools right now, but not necessarily on the the user. And and adds to this question. Those companies are not yet profitable. Many of them.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, I had another stat, which is that like GitHub, the COO announced on Twitter, I think in April, that at the current rate, GitHub contributions is up 14x year on year, and it's continuing to grow. So they expect that they'll finish the year with even more than 14x growth. And maybe that's why they're having some sort of challenges with like load and outages and things. But again, this is because like obviously people are pushing more code because now the thing, and also more people are joining, right? Because like I do expect that GitHub is going to become more of like an almost social network in the near future, that like as people get involved in the vibe coding space and they can build their ideas, one of the things they naturally will wonder is, how do I store this? Where do I save this? And of course the model will tell you, oh, you save it at GitHub, and you're like, cool. Make me GitHub, put it on GitHub. Yeah, I mean, I do think like a lot of these ideas, will be duplicates. Effectively there'll be like a huge amount of duplication, right? That like people are just going to build like a personal website, and of course they're going to be different because everyone has like a different thoughts or prompts or personality and whatever. But I mean, to some degree, like some of these ideas will be novel and interesting, right? That like they will, someone out there has an interesting idea for an app that they will do it, and like. I don't know how distribution is going to work, like in the sense that like obviously if you have a platform, if you're someone who has a large like follower base on social media or has a Substack with 250,000 followers, you can push out the message. You can say, hey guys, I've launched an app, and then some people will download it, some people will try it out, maybe they'll share it, there'll be this kind of like word of mouth.
You still assume, I think, in your projects, if I may, so you basically talk a lot of, people gonna use those tools, but they are still like the ones generating the ideas, right? And there is still like, we have still that edge kind of, but is that really true? Why could we not, ask, instead ask one of those agents, hey, generate 10 ideas and make products out of this?
I mean, you could. I mean, that's, what these loops are, right? You say like /loop and you say generate new product ideas, and then once you spin those off to some sub agent that builds it and then iterates on it, right? Yeah, you can do that, and that will create even more kind of noise in the world. So, I mean, I guess the other part to what I hear you saying is that like not everyone traditionally was what we used to call technical. Not everyone feels comfortable using a computer. Like it took a long time to get like some people onto computers, right? And even like the internet, maybe like they were laggards to the internet or whatever. And I think, to be honest, one of the things that's helpful here is that one of the challenges of like computers, one of the reasons we had IT literacy before was that computers were quite unlike anything else in our life, right? If you had a typo, if you were missing a semicolon, it just wouldn't work. Things would go red and it would give you error messages. And, errors were very exact, very precise, but also, again, for many people, a bit opaque because they're so exact, right? Tells you that like on line 77, there's no termination of some bracket. And they're like, what? Or, oh, you performed an illegal operation. And they're like, oh, no, I don't want to go to jail. And you're like, don't worry. It just means you access memory from some other application, right? Right. But, with these sort of chat interfaces and even voice interfaces, it's like so natural that you don't even need to know about it in some ways, right? That like, you could ask for a question and then it just does something under the hood and gives you kind of what you want, right? Like, I think that we're already in a world where like management or leadership doesn't need to have a dashboard built by some business analyst and then that dashboard just refresh daily and then they can go and check it, but rather to just ask a question to an agent like, how are our sales for this quarter? How do they compare to last year and the year before? And it just generates a bespoke visualization, and they look at it and they say, can you break it out by geography? And then, 30 seconds later, it's split by country or whatever else. And then they're like, cool, interesting. And then they discard it, right? Again, it doesn't have to be obvious to people that they're using software in some way, right? That like, you ask a question like, hey, I want to be notified whenever there's new news about Anthropic, and that the agent will call some API and register you with some news thing and set up, I don't know, some alerting, and you're like, Oh, maybe.
Okay. All right. I mean, it's all beautiful. I understand. But let me contrast this a little bit into my world of writing papers and so forth. So if I give many times, I can give similarly the same data set to different groups. They will analyze this data and they will interpret this data differently, right? And of course, that's why we sometimes run multiple studies. We write systematic reviews, and then these systematic reviews really tell us what really sticks on the wall, if you want to refer to this metaphor of throwing the pasta, right? And say, like, that's really the fact that we believe. That's basically empirical science, what I just basically sketched here. Now, if we have just one model, and we rely on one model to interpret all those things, and we, as the description that you just said with this CEO which wants a dashboard in order to analyze his last sales of the last quarter, we do not risk that, to be dependent on, what I'm trying to get to is this variation in variability of, let's say, human cognition, not a feature rather than a bug. And if you just rely on a model which does great maybe in certain areas because it was trained on great data, but is bad on other areas, and we do not risk to make which maybe failable in certain areas? Is that something that we should consider? Are there...
I mean, this concept of like outsourcing our thinking to machines is obviously a popular one. Like that, this is obviously a kind of bad thing, an anti-pattern. I think it even appears in science fiction, I think in Dune, for example. Like some people are like very kind of afraid. I mean, obviously if we outsource certain things to machines, we will lose those skills, right? Like if you haven't written Python for 6 months, you're going to become worse at Python. If you haven't even looked at Python in 6 months, you're going to become even worse, right? That's inevitable. But I guess the question is, why Python? Like when I was a child, back in the 90s, my dad showed me how to maintain a car, right? Like that was something I was going to do in my life at least once. I've never, ever in my life done anything beyond pouring the liquid into the window wiper fluid. When my car breaks, I just call someone, Right? Like he thought that was like some credible thing that people needed to do, fix like a timing belt, whatever that is, Right? Whereas clearly it's not for me, or so far it hasn't been. Maybe at some point in my 40s or 50s, I'll be like, oh, time to fix the timing belt, and I'll regret that I don't know how to do it anymore. And I think it's the same here, right? That like, we're not going to maybe need to know how exactly PyTorch works unless we are one of the people who develops PyTorch. Like nowadays, it's very nice that you can basically, like I yesterday was playing with this Numerai, this crowdsourcing data science competition. And I like, just in my Sunday, iterated through so many different models, so many different ideas, trained so many different things, compared different things. Whereas if I was actually doing this in the old world, I would have spent the day writing the PyTorch to just do the neural network. And I would have like trained it a few times and fiddled with some hyperparameters and got somewhere. Whereas instead I've like explored dozens of different models, dozens of ensembles, different classes of models, benchmarked things, submitted things to the competition. Like you just couldn't do this in the old world, right? Like, yes, I don't know exactly how the PyTorch is working. I don't know which exact layers the model has decided to put in there because I didn't bother to look at it. But, on the flip side, it's a bit like being a manager versus being an individual contributor. You can sort of see that the thing works and maybe you're happy with that outcome. But, it's just a different level of like operation.
I understand. But then in the end of the world, it's basically if we, all our skills get outsourced, that's basically your example, right? Get outsourced by AI, then it's just life turns into a fight for resources. That's it. I mean, because cleverness, what's cleverness if you have AI?
Well, so this is what's interesting, right? So actually, I think one thing I always found funny was like people often conflated education with intelligence. And I actually think that intelligence is more like your like learning rate, how fast you can adapt to new things and learn new things. Whereas like education can be a kind of a stock, right? Like in the sense that obviously if you're intelligent, you can increase that stock faster, but to some degree there's a stock, right? Like if you take the smartest person and someone who's been doing something for a decade, like it's gonna be very hard for the smart person to like immediately beat the person who's been doing something for a decade who just has deep expertise, right? obviously if they're learning at some rate and the smart person is learning at twice the rate in like 5 years, whatever, 7.5 years, they'll catch up or whatever, right? You know, well, excuse my bad math there, but you know, obviously if you can learn fast, that's what's important. If you're adaptive, you know, if like thrown into a novel situation and setting, you can kind of adapt to that setting. And I mean, ultimately this is one of those very strange shifts, right? I think it's hard. I mean, I would say for me, it's hard, right? To, you know, like in Google, the code was sacred. You know, the idea of the code was that the code should be perfect. Like, it was not abnormal to spend days or weeks going back and forth on a design doc, and then spend more weeks going back and forth on code reviews, arguing over nonsense like variable names or like whether to like put this in here or have it in a utils file. Whereas now, like, you can just build the thing, benchmark it, ask then, does it make sense? Like, did it actually work? Like, you don't need to argue about the variable names if it doesn't even work. But there you did. You had to spend months or weeks justifying it, convincing management that it should do it, you should do it, that it should be done. Put it on the list of priorities, put it above the fold so it doesn't get dropped. You know, start the project 12 weeks later, you know, after, then you benchmark it, find that it's not very useful, doesn't improve the metrics. And actually, it's actually hard to delete it at that point because you're emotionally invested because it's your baby. But that's not where we are now. Now it's like, move fast, implement it. And I wouldn't even say it's move fast and break things. Like with these agents, they're incredibly good at not breaking things, especially when you have like a second agent that reviews it and suddenly it finds some funny edge case that you as a human are like, okay. So yeah, it's a very different world. And I think our skills just need to adapt as such, right? And like,
yeah, I mean, I understand what I was trying to say. I mean, how can we be in charge of things if we don't know about the things that they are doing? So that's basically a bit of a paradoxical statement, but essentially of the way, if you want to decide about the future, about the things which are built or not, you should somehow understand what they are based upon and what resources they require or what their complexities are.
I mean, that's true. But I guess we could point to the managers in many companies don't really know how things work, you know, that, you know, for years they have employees, you know, they promise things that are impossible. Sales teams promise impossible things to customers who knowingly accept the impossible thing that couldn't exist. And then years later, something is delivered and they kind of squint a bit and go,
to a certain degree, you're saying knowledge doesn't need to be absolute.
Yeah. I mean, like what's interesting, I suppose, in some cases, like, you know, these things can be kind of verified or shown, maybe like that we can, you know, that for some things it's like possible to verify them more cheaply than to sort of generate them, right? You can verify certain kind of mathematics even if you can't even figure it out yourself in first principles, right? So that's cool. I mean, some source code can be obviously very rigorously reviewed, right? The model can say, hey, you can do it this way, and you look at it. You look at that one line synchronized threads and you reason about it. You say, yeah, actually, this makes sense. This should be here, and then you add it, you know, or like you flip a variable. You think, I think this is a typo, and you're like, it does look like a typo given it doesn't match the other three lines, you know, and you fix it, you know.
Okay, you sound a lot like an, you know, you believe this stuff to the full. You should. I have to ask this question more like this. So, are there nights that you wake up in the middle of the night, let's say, and you sort of fear a certain scenario? Is there anything which makes you, in a slightest possible way, concerned about AI agents in general?
I mean, I think the biggest worry I have here with AI is like, it takes society a long time to kind of catch up with some of these advancements. And I think this like period of advancement has been exceptionally crazy, even as someone who's watching it closely, right? I've basically dedicated the last few years to just watching it firsthand. So I think that like, I think there will be, you know, people become hugely more productive. There could be like mass layoffs. I mean, companies, the whole structure of companies needs to change. Like, it doesn't make sense to have all these bureaucrats. Like, I don't know how you can do 12-week planning unless you're going to just add thousands of items, you know, and like you're constrained by the backlog. Like, you don't have enough ideas. Like, the leadership team cannot mint enough ideas to keep 100 engineers busy, you know what I mean? Unless you have, you know, AI generating nonsense ideas, you know? So I think like, you know, there'll be major kind of social kind of disruption on the back of this. I would be amazed if there wasn't. I don't know what it will look like. And I'm not personally worried in the sense that I'm sure I'll figure out something to do or figure out some way of pivoting into whatever exactly is the new normal. But like it is going to be very disruptive for a lot of people, right? Because again, like I think there's probably a big opportunity for people right now who are smart and savvy to found startups in areas that are going to be a bit slower to adopt this technology. Like, let's say, as an example, let's say like accounting, for example, firms might be a bit more reluctant to leverage AI. And whereas if you were to build an AI accounting company that's, basically leveraging this AI technology and doing accounting, you could like drastically undercut the prices of these firms that employ loads of people. Likely you can get quality levels that are on par or, and improving, you know what I mean? Likely you just need to get like one or two like partners from those firms to defect and join your effort to give you the credibility to make this business like a hundreds of millions of dollar business, or like, like obviously law is a thing which is also being targeted as one of these, right? But again, it's also one that's been kind of historically a bit slow in technology wise, right? Like, I remember talking years ago to friends who literally would read huge documents to find if there were differences. And I'm like, that doesn't make any sense. Like, if you have a document and someone changes it, that should just be like recorded, like, and you could just diff the two documents and just like literally, are they the same? Are they different? You shouldn't have to manually read it line by line with two printed copies. You know what I mean? This crazy talk, right? So I think it will take time to roll out different industries. And I think that the implications to me are just really unclear. Like you can do so much, but then the bottlenecks just move. Like I think that like go to market and sales will become even more valuable. Like I think that like for the last few decades, being someone who's like smart and sort of introverted and really analytical was like super valuable, disproportionately valuable. I think that's about to shift again away from that potentially, right? That like, we need to sell our ideas to people. We need to communicate with people. It's something that, even though, yes, the AI could be convincing and maybe you can make a deep fake video to go with the thing and maybe that could be very convincing, but I still think like having relationships, having conversations, shaking hands, meeting people, that's...
Humans between humans?
Yeah, humans to humans, like, communicating to humans from humans, I think people will still kind of value that.
Speaking of which, I have to say, then since our audience in general, we are working here at the premises of ETH and university. What are, hearing what all you said, what are kind of the skills then, what piece of advice would you give to a student or a starting student maybe for the future? What skills should they focus on?
I think I would give the same answer I always gave in this regard, which is learning how to learn. Like, I think ETH is amazing, world class, so I don't think they have such the problem. The problem isn't so salient here as it is in other universities. But, for some reason, for some period of history, it became this sort of norm that you go to college to get a degree, and the degree kind of proves you're like reasonably intelligent, so that you're allowed to have a not shit job, right? Or I'm going to swear. You're allowed to have a good job, a reasonable job, right? Like if you don't have a degree, most jobs won't even consider you. Whereas then you have a degree, then they will consider you. And again, this is not a good system, but this is kind of what has emerged in much of the developed world. And again, a lot of university then was like just box ticking. It was like someone going there from 18 to 22 to get a piece of paper so that they're allowed to not have an entry-level job for the rest of their lives. Whereas I think what you need to do is learn how to learn. You need to learn how to think for yourself. You need to learn how to adapt, because the situation could be very different, right? Like, if you look at, like, say me, I've spent the last 12 years professionally, like, developing software and even longer writing it for fun, right? And, okay, that skill is now not so useful. Or I wouldn't say it's useless, like, it's good to have context, but, like, it's not something that is going to pay the bills going forward, right? So you need to kind of realize that and go with it. You can't, like, you can't, like, unless you want to be like some kind of cute artisan who makes hand-coded code and you present it to people on paper and they're like, oh, I love it, it's really authentic, I think it's not really a viable future model, right? And so if your skill was that you just learnt something arbitrary in college and that's what you thought was going to carry you for 40 years,
Let me play Advocatus Diaboli then. So learn how to learn so I can learn new skills and new things, but why should this even matter? Because AI knows them all.
That's true. Like, what's interesting is the knowledge or whatever we put into the public domain is like ingested and trained on or searched over, right? And so the model does effectively know more than you about almost every topic. But it's still important for your ability to kind of function and kind of make decisions and whatever as you go through the world. Until, I mean, maybe with someone who have some brain interface, that won't become as important. But like, you need to know what to do, what to ask for, where to go, right? And AI is an amazing tool for learning. It's funny, but paradoxically, it's both a big challenge to education formally, because now everyone can cheat on all their homeworks, and you can just say, please do my homework, and it just one-shots it, and then you hand it in and you get like, a good grade, like sweet. But on the flip side, it's also like a private tutor to everyone in the world, right? The reason education looks the way it does is because it's scalable, not because it's optimal, right? Like, I mean, ideally, the amazing professors here would be able to teach one-to-one to a student and make them really world-class, but that's only viable at the kind of PhD postdoc level, right? Because they have like a handful of students. You can't do that with hundreds or thousands. Whereas with AI, you can do that, right? Like, I can have a conversation with Claude, and Claude knows more about NVIDIA CUDA kernels than anyone I've ever met, including people at NVIDIA, and can go and is tireless and will talk to me all day and all night about it and kind of critique my ideas. I mean, the problem right now is because of sycophancy, sometimes they'll be a bit too kind of agreeable, which some humans are like that too, so I don't appreciate that, but you gotta push back.
So I understand. So we're just trying to really distill what you're saying. It's like the future. Max Buckley 3000. Is this gonna be a person which has, let's say, less technical skills than you now, but has maybe an emotional intelligence which is much, much higher than yours? Is that going to be the future, or is it just going to be maybe a person which is a generalist, a person which knows a lot about many different things, but no specialization really, because those can be this person can get those from the tools? What kind of people do you expect is going to be the future engineer? What do you think this person going to be like from a skills profile?
I mean, I would say like a future engineer will still be, intelligent on average, I mean, whether they're extroverted or introverted, I think is still flexible. I don't think it matters as much as that they are more intelligent, that they understand like how things work. I mean, what certainly becomes clear with these things is that it's still important that you are, you have good language ability, that you can actually clearly communicate what you want and clearly communicate what you're being told, what's being told to you, right? And you can quickly kind of assimilate that information and kind of update your mental model. Obviously having things like math skills is important to actually understand some kinds of communication, right? Or like whatever is the relevant skill set, right? That, maybe it's algorithms or asymptotic complexity or whatever else, right? Like if you ask Claude, like, how do I optimize this? And Claude starts giving you, well, this is going to be this complexity and that complexity. Like it assumes you understand complexity. If you don't, it can explain it to you, but that's going to take longer, right? Like, I can learn to do my taxes in Switzerland with Claude, and it will take me way longer than someone who's a Swiss tax accountant who is just asking a small question, on the way through their process or whatever. Or maybe I can just trust Claude to do my Swiss taxes very soon, which would be amazing.
If I understand you correctly, you don't believe the future engineer will not have less technical skills. He probably have similar skills. Probably doesn't know how to program. He doesn't need to know how.
I think the programming thing is like, it's going to be still taught a bit like assembly is taught today, right? As like, here's a cool historical thing. Like some of you may go on to use this again. The vast majority of you won't. Like that. A bit like if you do like a degree in something like media or design or communication or whatever, they often show you the printing press and they have you like stamping paper, as like, hey, remember newspapers? And you're like, cool.
Okay, so I understand. You're basically referring, this is just a better tool to use instead of programming. Programming just will be, go out of fashion because we can have better tools to get what we want or achieve what we want. Now, we talk a lot about how students or, people getting to the AI could be, how going to be the future of these people look like. But coming back to Zurich, to Europe, we talk about models, open source models, these limitations, regulation about AI and so forth, and how companies deal with it, especially Anthropic. Now, what is your 2 cents? How do you think Europe can be competitive going forward? Also, we looked into this. I know the amount of GPUs is rather small here in Europe in comparison to the US, for instance. And you even talked about this story about Joe Biden restriction. So, what are the things that in order to be competitive, should we fight for more resources? What would you advise?
I mean, I'm a bit disappointed in the sense that, Europe has kind of missed several technology shifts in a row, and the problem is they're all sort of correlated, right? Like, not having our own kind of large scale sort of tech super hyperscalers kind of sets us up badly for a world in which AI and compute becomes hugely important, right? Like, it's not that we could just, ideally we could get involved in the AI race without the previous parts, but it's not super likely, right? Like, a lot of the large players either are themselves, like Google, hyperscalers, or they depend very closely on hyperscalers like OpenAI, depending on Microsoft historically. Anthropic had deals with AWS.
Is this train gone? Is it? Yeah. Well, too late?
I think obviously things can change, right? Look at COVID is probably the best example I can think of, right? Where European governments really did something. Like, they actually said, oh, this is something, things are changing, like things are shutting down, things are, money is being flowing around, right? Things can happen. Or like making new legislation, like just doing it. But, can we catch up? Like, Mistral is often cited as the European frontier lab, but Mistral has sort of silently pivoted into being more of a consulting company. Like, Mistral was never at the frontier, like, to be fair, right? Mistral released
shots have been fired.
No. Mistral released a 7B, which was like an amazing 7 billion parameter model, right? And they released the Mistral model, which was like one of the first open source mixture of experts models, which was also very performant, especially for the active parameter count. And then they've, since then they've released a few other things, but like none of these were like at the kind of absolute frontier. Like, they were the best things you could run locally for a while, but they were not like, the GPT-4 class of models, right? And like, a bit like Cohere before them, they've kind of moved more into the like, let's work with big companies, let's work with governments, let's work with like on-prem deployment of our models, for companies that don't want to use these cloud-based things. And don't get me wrong, they're an amazing company doing amazing work, but it's not entirely like they're not like Google is chasing in like third place for the like let's make AGI, and then maybe XAI is also there in like fourth place if they're, I don't know exactly what they're up to. But then there's like everyone else is doing other things, so they've kind of pivoted, right? Let's say Cohere has dropped out, they've dropped out. They're
so you're basically trying to make a point. There's nothing right now.
There's nothing in Europe that like looks like it's credibly there now. Saying that, like, could government come together and spend, I don't know, billions and try to put it together? In theory, yes. In practice, I think it's hard. Like, I think that, inter-European politics, like, where would you put it, right? Every country would argue for themselves, and then that would obviously splinter things. Even if you got like an agreement that, well, let's put it in some country, probably the especially if there's a government kind of collaboration, I think the compensation levels would not be aligned with what the US is willing to pay.
But there are sort of EU-wide movements, like to facilitate funding for startups, regulation also and things like that. You don't think?
Well, I can't imagine any of the governments approving giant paychecks that are disproportionately above like the national average salaries. There was an Anthropic job listing in Zurich recently, and the job salary, not equity, was 680,000 CHF listed. That's salary alone, right? Plus the equity, which this year alone has gone 100x or whatever. But like, can you imagine a government-funded job offering to pay so much money? Could you imagine the outcry from the public if they found out that the median employee in this like new AI research lab was earning 12 times the national average salary?
I think, I would say that's the similar discussion they are having with CEOs, and Novartis families back then had this big discussion with one of their CEOs here in Switzerland. It was a discussion, but I think the public understood to a certain extent that in order to be competitive, attract the best managers, we have to pay. So once you get this, you try to apply for this extra funding, and if you have to get this funding, you have to pay one of your coworkers that amount of money, because in order to be competitive, I think this.
You think it's understood? Mm-hmm. Well,
I think there would be a chance for that. I think it's less accepted than for sure in the US. I would agree with you, but I think on the CEO level, that seems to work as well.
Well, I mean, I suppose the thing with the CEO is there is one CEO. If you have like your frontier lab, I don't know what the wage bill is in some of these labs, but like, I imagine it's like, I mean, excluding equity is like definitely, at least in the kind of higher, almost $1 million probably per person per year. And then with equity, ridiculous amounts, like all these people are becoming millionaires, hundreds of millionaires, right? I mean, again, it's not unassailable. If you could convince people that this is somehow equitable and fair, I think that maybe that would work. But I say, you also need to also think about the whole full stack buildup, right? That like, even if we, for argument's sake, like the Europeans came together today and said, okay, we're going to go in Germany and we're going to like bring all these people in, we're going to pay them all $1 million a year each base, plus we're going to give them some magical new equity. And you'd also like need like the data centers, and like Elon is like the only person to date who's managed to build a data center in like reasonable time. Normally, when you
in the Western world.
Yeah, in the Western world, that's true. In China, it's easy, everyone can do it in China. But yeah, so like, I don't know, like, he's been trying. Even he has been struggling to build a Tesla gigafactory in Berlin, outside Berlin, right, or some Tesla factory. So,
I have to ask the same question, maybe almost the same question again. So, I feel some skepticism here, to say the least, that Europe will. It's hard for Europe to stay competitive. You mentioned the salary aspect. You're mentioning maybe regulation and the speed, essentially.
Saying that, like, they say this is about peacetime, right? Like, obviously, sometimes society is jolted into action, like COVID, right? Like, things happen fast, right, in a way that they hadn't happened before. I mean, similarly, like, when war breaks out, oftentimes society's perception changes and fast, right? I think that Europe 2031 piece that came out last week was very interesting. And, like, I think that, it's funny that we already saw it with this Fable lockdown a day later. That like something will happen that will kind of jolt people into action, that people will be like, oh, wow, this is panic stations, But I guess one of the problems that we have is that a lot of our leaders, I think, are non-technical. And obviously, what I mean by that is they just don't understand technology. They don't necessarily use technology. I was recently in Singapore, and
I haven't heard this. What do you think? I'm not sure. I know Trump or.
I'm not saying that the Donald is technical, but I'll give you an example, right? So they say China is run by engineers. That's why famously, right? I was recently in Singapore and at this AI Engineer Summit, and the opening speaker was the Minister of Foreign Affairs for Singapore, and he was presenting on stage at the AI Engineer Summit about the open claw he had built to manage a bunch of his personal effects and how it worked and whatever else. This guy is a medical doctor who's built his own custom AI setup running locally in his house. And he's presenting at an AI conference showing it. And he basically said on stage that, like, you cannot govern a technology you don't understand. Right? That, like, he's actually built and understands this. Like, he's explaining, like, how he's optimized different levels of stack, how he's integrated security and all this other stuff, right? And, like, that's the kind of, I think, what we kind of need. We need more builders and engineers and more people who are more optimistic about the future than more pessimistic. Like, people who are not worried about the risks, but worried about, like, missing out, I suppose, would help. And maybe, it got to be like, become the change you want to see in the world, maybe.
It's exciting. I think it's the first time that also, it's still like the first season of this podcast, so I'm really curious to hear more. But I think many people have mentioned infrastructure as one of the potential, or, when I talk with people, they mention a lot the bottleneck infrastructure, right? They mention the compute aspects, the fragmented market aspects.
Yes.
The regulation, which is not, the same across EU. Of course, we're trying to improve these right now. But nobody I mean, at least to me in person, have ever mentioned the way of politics, the people itself. So,
Yeah.
and I heard culture before, but you're not saying culture. What you're saying is basically we need people in power which understand technology, and you allude this to the Eastern world, which this seems to be more the case, and this has advantages. And this could be a potential strategy going forward. I mean, that sounds exciting. I don't know. I don't have any numbers. I don't know how prevalent the distribution is of engineers in the government, for instance. I have no clue. I would imagine that even in the Responders-Rat, I don't think many of them have an engineering background. I might be wrong though. So this, you have to change the people first. Kinda.
Yeah.
You're saying.
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's funny growing up. So I'm Irish, and growing up in Ireland, engineer or software, which first of all we didn't use the word engineer to describe computer scientists, right? First thing, right, was just computer science or IT or software development or something, And second of all, computer science was like a non-prestigious subject, like as in we have this end of school exam system where you get points based on how well you did in different subjects, and you kind of aggregate it, and like typically the top choices, like the best students, the ones who got like what was 600 points when I was younger, they would go to law, that was like one of the most, or medicine. Like computer science had an entry of like 300 and something. It was like way down. Like you didn't need to be a particularly good student to do computer science. It wasn't considered like, parents would be very proud if their son or daughter was a lawyer or a doctor. And like my parents' generation or whatever would be very surprised to learn that you can earn way more money in IT and technology than you do as a doctor or a lawyer. That would blow their minds. Routinely does, And so like, and I think the UK is the same, right? Where like there's a very much a kind of like a premium or a prestige put on certain professions over others. And, it's interesting because like in America, if your kid studies computer science, or like if you're in India, your kid studies computer science, you're like, yes. If they go to an IIT and do CS, they're off to like Stanford for their masters or Google for their first job, or, they're going to like make bank.
Yeah, I think, of course, it is historically driven. I mean, lawyers have been around for a very long time, or, doctors or medical doctors as well. So I think it's also historically driven. Of course, it's still like a fairly new job.
Yeah.
And
I mean, it's also true in America, right? That, maybe they had more exposure to CS than the rest of the world, or than Ireland for sure. But yeah, it's not to say that doctors and lawyers aren't like amazing jobs, right? But it sort of speaks to the aspirations and the quality of like the talent going in or something, right? That like, the best students go on to do medicine or law, and then middling students will go on to do these like engineering, like. And again, like they're just not as visible or like not as sort of celebrated, like the, intergenerational, I don't know, effects.
But I mean, you've been very optimistic about the use of technology. You've been less optimistic about Europe in general and its competitiveness. So I have to ask, do you see any silver lining there? How we can turn this around? Of course, you already proposed an area of improvement, but I want to say, like, do you see any optimism there?
I mean, again, there's a funny time in history that we find ourselves at, right? Which is that like we can finally build our own sovereign stack, or we can build it more easily using AI. But the irony is we'll build it using American or Chinese models, We can finally make a European operating system or a European cloud or a European but we'll do it with American or Chinese AI running on American chips. Like, but saying that, at least we have some part of the stack. But it does feel like a tricky time in the sense that, like, I think if you had asked me this question 12 months ago, I would have said, okay, we need to organize and align some of these things and build some of these various pieces, and it would feel more defensible. Whereas I feel like now it feels more tricky, just because, like, I don't know, maybe I'll regret saying this, but like I feel like we're kind of in that slow takeoff or whatever, that or fast takeoff, who knows? We're in this kind of like accelerating kind of point, right? Like I think that some of these ideas you hear spouted, like, we should force our companies to use our European models, would just disadvantage them, And like even our, even if our companies or governments did use these European models, the revenue wouldn't even be that great when you compare it to the revenue that like an Anthropic or an OpenAI or a Google is going to make, right? Even if you get like $1 billion from like 3 big governments, that's like $3 billion a year, Whereas,
But what about, there were success stories, Spotify or other startups which made it, I think, which are global players, I would say. No? So essentially it's possible. But
I mean, I don't think it's that you can't make a startup in Europe. I mean, I think that's a different sort of like a more like micro kind of like level concern, right? Like I think that like, you can make a startup and you can make something cool. Saying that if you do that, very likely you'll be, acquired by a US sort of shark. More likely than if you were in the US, for example. And it's harder to raise funds and whatever else. So I don't want to say that you can't do that, but I think it's more like, how does Europe as a whole get itself out of the hole that it's in? Europe as a whole with a W.
No pun intended. Right?
And that's where I think it's tricky, right? Like I think that like absolutely like you and I could create a company today doing like fine tunes of apparatus, and we're making some cool stuff, But I think that's fine, on a cluster that runs in our office, you know what I mean? But I think that when it goes to like, we're not gonna, me and you are gonna have trouble raising like $1 trillion, That's which is the new norm, Everyone's a trillionaire these days,
Okay, I really trying my best here, but I will rephrase this question maybe in a slightly different manner.
Okay.
Maybe I get the answer that I like.
Sounds good.
So essentially, imagine you gotta tell somebody. So the premise is that they have to build a startup that's not changeable in Europe, and it's based on AI. Okay, it's an AI startup, the new one. How would you tell them to be successful? What would you advise them?
Yeah, I mean,
so go for it, try your best, but consider A, B, and C. What would that be?
I mean, as I say, I do think you can make a successful startup here. That's not that you can't. Like, I think that probably you can, make a AI for something that, I don't know, provides like value to people, right? Like you build an app that has AI and advises you on travel, and under the hood, it's like a Claude wrapper, I don't think that is undoable, you know what I mean? And, you can make like, some money and it's fine, right? But, and like, if your thing is small enough, maybe they don't even care to try to like take it from you, you know what I mean? Like that you're like 1,800 on the App Store for Switzerland, and like no one's gonna try to interfere with your revenue stream of 30 grand a month, So I definitely think you can do it. I think it gets harder when you think about like the, battling for the big, thing. As I say, like, when Mistral was founded, when they had that document about they wanted like sort of sovereign AI back in 2023 in March maybe. They shared that Google Doc where they had their like 4 names on it, and they were all like ex DeepMind or Meta, like L6s, L7s. That was, I think, like the time to do that. I think that they chose a very good time. I think that had they got another 500 billion, like maybe they, now they could also be at the trillion spot. Like I don't mean to be a doomer. Like I'm not a negative person. Like, but I just. Like one thing that's different about America to here that I find, just culturally, and here I mean broadly, like not Switzerland necessarily, but even Ireland, whatever, is that we have, include myself among this, the European startup mindset, I would say, whereas in America they have this American startup mindset, right? Which is in Europe, I feel like people often look for the right idea. They're often waiting for an idea that they think, oh, that's worth some money, and then they will suggest to sort of maybe go for it. Whereas in America, people start startups with terrible ideas all the time. Like when I go and meet my people in the YC, loads of their startups I think don't make sense. Like I think that they sound good as a feature within a larger application. They sound good as a feature within Gemini, or good as a feature for Claude, or good as a feature within like Google Docs or something. But for some reason they're making it as a startup. And the thing is, many of them will fail. Many of them will pivot into something else, maybe keeping some drip of like essence that was related. But what's interesting is even if they fail, like yes, they've lost like a few $100K of YC's money, and whatever else they raised or put into it themselves. But, they've learned a lot about building startups, and like while they're doing it, they're, buying from other startups are buying their product, they're becoming more experienced in the whole ecosystem. Like one thing that they do a great job of is building this pipeline, this ecosystem. Like a lot of the product managers I worked out with in Google who were in California, they were almost all ex-founders, all ex-YC. They all thought about like customers really firsthand. Whereas a lot of the PMs that I worked with in Europe were like ex-corporate, like ex-McKinsey, or like, they had like, just come out of college or whatever. Like, they didn't have the same kind of startup.
Yeah, I like this very a lot. We are back to what we discussed, not learn how to learn, but learn how to build, and, being down to do this journey, right? First and foremost, and that's the best way to be successful.
Yeah. Like I definitely have, and I've seen stories like friends of mine who've like founded a startup, and kind of like I was initially like skeptical about what they were doing. And it turns out a while later, they were also skeptical because they pivoted it and then they found something that made a lot more sense. And it's like very interesting to kind of see, right? Like, like I think in America, they index much more on the team and the caliber of the team and much less on the idea. Like if you have like 3-4 like awesome people, they're like, yeah, that's worth a few million. Here you go. Whereas here it's like, you're being asked, like, do you have like product market fit? Does it make sense? And it's like, it doesn't matter if it makes sense. It just matters that you have good people. So you'll figure it out.
Yeah, that's good to hear. I mean, especially since I still think one of the biggest advantages of Europe is the talent. It doesn't feel to me that we don't have or don't educate, or if you want to use the develop good builders, researchers, engineers. I think we still have, people pouring out of the universities, or so we still have the talent here. So why not could we make it possible? That's what makes me so optimistic about the whole thing. But of course,
I mean, I definitely agree with you. Like, I think we have amazing talent. I think the people here are absolutely. Like, I don't think that some people say, "Oh, the caliber of talent is better in San Francisco." I don't really see that. I do see that they have been incentivized differently. They have a different approach to life. Like here, a lot of people, what's the old expression? They work to live. Like they do their job and they go home in the evening, and then they do their hobbies or whatever, or they take the weekend doing their whatever thing that they want to do. Whereas I think in San Francisco, people live to work. Like it's much more normal to work after hours, into the night, the weekends. It's much more common to juggle multiple jobs, especially if the second or third job is your personal passion project startup that you're trying to build. It's much more common for people to be involved in the startup ecosystem in some capacity. So like either people are previous founders or they are advisors to their friends' startups, they're investors in early stage startups. And again, all of this is giving them exposure to the whole ecosystem, right? Like I went to Startup Tower in March with a friend who has a startup. And when I was there signing in on the like iPad, the security guard was talking to some other visitor or whatever. And then the security guard said, "I have a longevity startup." And I thought that's hilarious, that even the security guard is building a startup. And like it's very common. Like whenever I'm in San Francisco, like from the moment I land in the airport, every Uber I get, almost every Uber driver has at least 2 jobs. And like the second job is they're making a startup. And sometimes they have 3 jobs. And again, it's not good in the sense that like they're driving an Uber, they're working in a bar, and they have a startup. Like that's not sustainable maybe, or stressful. But like the fact that they have the belief that they're going to do it, the fact that they're sinking those time into building something or whatever and they're trying to give you their business card, they're trying to get you to invest in their startup. It's a very different.
How to generate that, that inception, that belief in people that they can make it through building their own thing. Yeah.
And well, one thing that's also a bias, right, is that like a lot of the best, most motivated, most hungry people from here move there. Like I know several ETH alumni who are Swiss who have founded YC startups, who have founded startups in San Francisco. I know people from EPFL who are there doing it. You know what I mean? Like they're taking the motivated people from here or from elsewhere, right? It's the same in Ireland, right? Stripe, for example, famously, 2 Irish brothers founded Stripe. So sort of a American-Irish success story.
Yeah, I mean, I cannot comment on that particular case, but I think what I feel here, I think also it's too early to call it, but many times it's also just the access to capital, which is just, very different in California, to say the least. And this is just a large, big pool. And that's what I hear from all the people that I know, which went and did a startup. And not necessarily, I want to go there because that's the best place to build, or there's, I don't get the talent here, or all those kinds of maybe other limitations. But, it's true. I agree what you say. And, let's see how this moves forward. Let's come to maybe concluding questions, or let's say last points to discuss. We started with the queries and questions, and how this will develop. So I want to just, since you're already sitting in front of me, how will this move forward? So since large language models can generate all these answers, you talk about RAG. How will this? How does the future of this technology look like, according to you?
So there's a few things, right? One thing is that historical search engines were optimized for lazy humans, right? So, people don't want to have to type very much. So, you want to make the kind of queries like short and work well, right? So if someone's going to search red shoes, even though they want to buy red Converse, they just didn't want to type that, So, you just got to guess from red shoes that it's probably has commercial intent, show them some pictures, hopefully you put the red Converse in there. People are happy, right? With LLMs or AI agents or whatever you want to call them, they can generate almost instantly very long, rich queries, nuanced queries, right? So they could write a long query which says like, red Converse, high top, size 12, blah, 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 stripes, And that's obviously much more specific than the red shoes. And like that query can, obviously immediately be targeted to exactly that kind of shoe, that particular entry, right? So that's obviously very useful and valuable. And there's a lot of like plumbing under the hood to like make this better and better and better, right? To just index the web, index what exists. Especially as like we have more and more AI agents, there's going to be more and more content generation, more and more information will exist, right? The rate of like new websites is increasing. The rate of new, as I say, like apps, all this is increasing, right? So being able to like index it and find it quickly and effectively is an increasingly important task, right? Like even if the sort of training window is getting shorter, just the rate of new stuff is increasing, right? So when you ask a question, you want to get like the freshest data. So yeah, and another area which is also where this is interesting is like actually agentic retrieval, is that like agents learning, not just being told you have a search tool, here it is, like naively, but like giving it like a rich, powerful search tool where it can really richly slice and accurately, quickly kind of filter through the web, right? And again, this can be something that your model is doing or is hidden from you under the hood, right? Like if you are willing to wait a few seconds, right? Like our historic search model was this instant, like a few hundred milliseconds retrieval, right? You type in a statement, press enter, and you get the results. But if we put a generative model in the loop, then there can be some thinking, some reasoning. There can be different tool calls under the hood, right? So we can kind of search in different databases for different things. We can filter in different ways, pre-filter, post-filter, whatever you want, and get you just the kind of information that you need.
So you mentioned two things, if I may distill it that way. One is, how to find the right information. What is the right information? I mean, this remains a challenge, especially if the information will change. That's basically what you alluded to, because now agents will create that information, and how can you manage to achieve the same? And of course, the second one, which is, I would say, the original challenge, more of the region, the scale, right? How can you make this as fast as possible, as as easy for people to access and get this information as quickly as possible, right?
Yep.
Do you think it will change how we gonna access the web or this information? I
think so. Like, to be honest, ever since ChatGPT appeared, even before it had a web search tool, it immediately cannibalized a large chunk of my own web queries. And I would say once it got a web search tool, it cannibalized even more of my web search queries. Now, this wasn't visible in Google's numbers, or at least it hasn't been, like I wasn't aware of it, or wasn't really communicated that like queries are going down. And in fact, obviously Google has also built in AI search overview as a thing, right? Where, you do a search and it gives you a kind of guess at the answer up top. But it is actually happening now that when this search overview appears, a huge chunk of queries are now no-click queries. So the user did not click on any of the links. And so this is obviously a huge change in how web search works. This is a huge change in how publishing works as a digital publishing as an industry, right? Because the old world model was that you show ads on your website. So Google drives traffic to your website because, someone searches for like, I don't know, articles about Europe and AI. Then they find a link to your page, you click on the link, and then on your page you show like ads for like the latest NVIDIA GPUs and Anthropic subscriptions, you know, like. Whereas now, if people don't click on your page, if the AI overview synthesizes your information into the AI overview and it just gives someone the answer, then you don't get any ad revenue, you know. So then you're wondering, why are you hosting this, you know? Anthropic or Nvidia don't get any impressions; they're not happy, you know. It's a major disruption in the whole ecosystem.
But in the same thing, so there was, like the concerns, like,
Yeah.
of course, those companies could be maybe challenged. That are they really profitable now? Are they going to use some form of advertisement in the future? That's still up in the air.
Yeah, I mean, there were like talks or rumors, I guess, that OpenAI was going to use ads, and I think it's likely to happen. I mean, there's already this strange shadow industry, or like there is already like the models already have built-in kind of preferences, implicit and probably rather than explicit, right? In the sense that like if you ask any of these models, even in like kind of a new conversation, right, where you don't have your personal history involved, and say like, give me the 3 best German car brands, it will have to put some ordering on like BMW, Mercedes, whoever else, right? Porsche. It's probably relatively consistent over time, over different users, right? You can check this, you can measure this yourself. There's a whole industry called SEO, right? So it is effectively endorsing certain options over others, even without us having a kind of paid advertising. It's more like organic search versus pay-per-click. But it definitely is in the interests of companies like imagine you're BMW and you're second place. Like, you definitely want to be first place, because many people will say, I want to buy a German car, what should I buy? And it will just say Mercedes, and you're like, cool. What's a timing belt? As a throwback.
So of course there are implicit, orderings of certain, you mentioned companies, and this could be already be done through deals, or how Anthropic or other OpenAI goes about them. Of course, the dark side is, but this is the same challenge that Google had. These Google queries, Google searches can influence, even political outcomes and things like that. So based on what the first results that appear, so how will this be governed in the future? And that's again, to the question.
That's a question for the EU, I guess.
Yeah.
How much to fine the different companies? It's like, what's interesting as well is like Google as a system was much more interpretable. You know what I mean? In the sense that you can kind of like deterministically say, okay, for this query, this result comes up in this kind of position or whatever else, right? Like if you think about the LLM case, like if the LLM is using a search tool, the search tool itself is somewhat interpretable, but the actual LLM's kind of preferences are like baked into the weights right there. And not only the weights, if you have a large context, then obviously the context is influencing the kind of probability distribution. Like if you look at the next token probability, when the best German car brand is, what probability mass is it putting on the like Mercedes prefix versus BMW versus Audi, right? And you could like say, okay, how does it change as I permute the input? How does it change as I, permute the context? So it's much harder to interpret and kind of reason over, right? That like literally like some random word being put in at the beginning will likely significantly shift the probabilities up or down, right? And for every user nowadays, we all have a custom history, even if you aren't aware of this. Like if you're using the history feature, then Claude or ChatGPT or Gemini, they already know a bunch of stuff about you, right? So that's how they refer to things in your life or recall specific things you're doing or working on, right? And it's very useful, but it also makes it much harder to know which one it would recommend, right? Like if it knows you're like right wing and it wants to endorse the right wing option versus if it knows you're left wing and it endorses the left wing option, how do you as an advertiser know? I mean, unless they offer some aggregated statistics about, how many times it's endorsing A versus B, it's.
Do I understand? So basically what you're describing, there are agents, and there's the internet and there's the layer in between.
Yeah.
And that's basically, your proponent where Exa is maybe creating. Do you see a future where there are, in this AI stack, multiple of those layers in between the agents, and that and there's, it seems like it's like basically it's not just one truth, there are multiple truths. The same thing about knowledge. There's not one knowledge, there's multiple knowledge.
Yes, I think there are. Even in the space Exa is playing in, there are other competitors, right? I mean, obviously like the big players have their own systems, like Google has its own search APIs, which are like not I mean, they're available through search grounding with Google Gemini if you use GCP and Gemini, but they're not generally available. Microsoft obviously has the Bing search index, which they've also locked down under Azure. There's Brave Search, there's Tavily, there's a parallel search. So there isn't just Exa, right? But even within Exa or even within any of these companies, there's going to be AI working at different levels, right? There's like AI working kind of like on query time, but also offline at like indexing time, right? So, documents might be being like aggregated or clustered based on the decisions of AI LLMs, which is ultimately determining like which things go together and which things go elsewhere and they get served somewhere, right? So when you like make a search query, maybe your query again triggers an LLM on the Exa side to generate like a specifically federated query across different backends, which gets back the results, which is like aggregated into some kind of tabular format and filtered, and then that's given back to your agent, which iterates over all of the people or companies or locations and does some operations with it. So it's like AI all the way down. It's kind of like this infinite turtles,
The infinite turtles. I mean, it's very exciting. So maybe just to look into the future and maybe some concluding question. I mean, maybe the last question. Let's say, maybe I'm lying, but just to develop the thought a bit further, how do you imagine, a developer, let's say a professional in the future, really working, let's say broadly with the internet? How many agents does this person have? What is basically the interface that this person is really using? I mean, and what is maybe going under the hood there? How would you picture this? Maybe it doesn't need to be 5, maybe 10 years from now. How would you see this? Like some person interacting via microphone? Maybe?
I mean, I feel like the word agents I always find confusing in the sense that like how do we like discretize them? You know what I mean? Like as in, do you have like a software engineering agent that's just doing many tasks, or is that n different software engineering agents? Like each conversation is kind of like an agent. It's a transient agent. It's like created, it does like some task, and then it disappears into the like ether, right?
But let's say you have a call to an LLM which has access to
persistent memory.
Yeah, persistent memory. But I mean, you could have more LLMs to access to the same persistent memory, so it's a hard question to make. But
yeah, so like I guess like the reason I make this distinction is that like if you think about, or at least the way I currently kind of see it, is that most things I consider a bit like transient, like they kind of, I mean, I know there is obviously some degree of memory in the sense that I just described, right? But, for most senses, there's like the code base. And then when you like merge things in, then you've advanced the state of the code base. And the other things only exist kind of in that conversation thread until they are merged in. Like in theory, you can search over them, but like, again, there's a lot of noise to some degree of like signal, like as in, I'm having a conversation about what I want to do and blah, 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 blah. And the end result is like an email that's sent out. And then most of that is just like, you could forget about it. You know what I mean? There's a kind of question about like what you persist versus what you discard.
Okay, let me rephrase this, okay? I mean, I'm an engineer. I'm resulting here to very lay terms. But okay, I'm trying my best. But okay, let's say how many, maybe that's the best, independent threads
will you have
open?
So this is something that, again, I find I'm dealing with or trying to figure out, right? Like there's definitely a cognitive load to having threads open and having to kind of like psychologically keep track that they're open, right? Like even if they're doing nothing, like once I spin up a thread, like if I send code to some other team in the US, there's some part of my brain is like dedicated just monitoring that thread even though nothing is happening on it. Because I have to like ping the guy when he wakes up and then he get him to approve it. And then when he approves it, I can merge it. And then once it merges, I kind of want to like check that it like shipped or like check that it worked, that I hope, you know what I mean? And until that's done and I can like close that thread, it's still kind of open and like consuming some degree of brain resources, right? Which is very annoying, I would say. It's like my newest, like one of my newer annoying things I didn't really have before. So like, when I'm like full throttle doing development, maybe I have like 8 parallel threads open. And then maybe a few sort of semi-dormant threads like that one, right? Where it's just been sitting for like weeks. But like, again, right now, like one of the bottlenecks is that, you can kind of see code review as like kind of like a distributed system where there's this like the state of the code and you have like, this is kind of like what you need to change, right? And you have all these threads that want to change it, and you want to like lock it so one can do it and two can do it. And so if you have like too many things hitting the same code, you start tripping on your own toes on like merge conflicts. You end up getting into this merge queue. It's frustrating. The CI/CD also wants to run like every time. So I personally don't go beyond like 8. I mean, but again, it also depends on the thing. Like one thing I find again is probably even knowing how to use these tools, in the sense that I love sending off like deep researches before I go to sleep at night, because then they're done by the time I wake up. You know, so then I'm on the train. I'm often reading like a Claude deep research that I triggered like when I was in bed before I went to sleep.
Makes sense. What I'm trying to get to, I mean, you meant 8, and you know, you said parallel, which already like kind of implying a structure, or an organization structure.
Yeah.
So you know, how do humans organize? If I do it right now without agents, I can do something on my own. I can go and try to build something out there in the outdoor. But I'm of course more successful if I have some friends helping me. And maybe I can even achieve more, being more efficient if I create some sort of a structure, how we cooperate, how, you know, who deals with what kind of queries, maybe who is the leader, maybe who is the worker, and things like that. So the question is, what's aiming towards this? How will this be done? Will I just basically, as you said, maybe alluded to, maybe it's too difficult for a human being to have so many threads open. Maybe we just operate with one agent essentially, but there's like a whole organization, how those agents are done and distributes tasks and do this. And essentially, it's more of the question, how many resources does a professional really have? So I'm just trying to say, are we gonna have more compute per individuals, right? And in the end of the day, in order to all those questions will be solved, essentially, how agents should work together, and basically we just give them problems and they organize, and based on the resources that they have, and then deliver us the output? Or how do you think this to be in the future, really?
I mean, it doesn't seem hard to believe that you could give a higher level goal, like a larger, broader task, and that it would decompose and do that, right? You know, I say like it's not abnormal for me to like run a task that takes like 8-ish hours and involves doing many steps and many things, right? So the idea that you could give a task that takes like a week is not unreasonable by next year. I don't know. You know, and again, maybe a week-long task takes a bit more like writing in advance, so as to kind of make it kind of clear what the overall goal is. But it feels like the individual steps can be kind of broken down and accomplished, right? Like, I mean, you know, you can, like, oftentimes what I do is I actually like have the Claude web UI generate a spec, you know, after a conversation of what we want to do, and then that's what becomes the seed for Claude Code. But again, that seed could be itself like a very, very large thing. It doesn't have to be, you know, something that finishes in 30 minutes. It could take 8 hours, especially if it has to like wait on jobs that are actually running to actually get like empirical feedback on how things work, or whether they crash, whether they fail, whether they can compile. So yeah, I mean, I definitely could see it getting longer and longer, right? That like not just like a deep research that takes like a 30 minutes, but like something that a deep research that takes a week. I mean, I don't know what exactly it's doing, but like somehow, you know, like, I mean, ideally, you know, it would do more and more and just kind of come back to you when it's done. And again, I'm very impressed, like with I use the Devin from Cognition a lot, and I'm really impressed by the capability. So this is not just like, this is like a harness in the sense that like it's using Claude, Opus, or Mythos, or you know, GPT 5.5 under the hood as the model, but like it plugs into all of the systems we have at Exa, right? So it basically is like the brain of the company. Like, you know, you go to Devin and say like, hey, how does this work, or what's going on here? And like it reads the documentation, it talks to the databases, you know, to fetch information, do analysis, it edits the source code, it can manage deployments, it even has a credit card, it can buy stuff. Like, you know, it's crazy, right? That you could say like, order us some food to the office, and it will, and like it can find your preferences saved in a file, so it knows that I don't like sushi, or that I do like spicy food. I mean, sometimes I might send it to like San Francisco by accident, but you know, otherwise it's amazing. It's absolutely amazing.
All interconnected.
Yeah, yes, and like again, like I can be on my phone and send a Slack message and say, hey, can we check this? And if it's not the case, do that. And then like by the time I get back to the office, I'll have a pull request waiting for me, and the pull request will have in turn triggered the automation, like webhooks from other LLMs that will review it, right? So Devin making the pull request will trigger Codex to jump in and review it, and Codex will say, hey, you've like, you know, duplicated an enum here, you shouldn't do that. And then Devin will automatically respond and fix it. And so I'll just come in and be like, approved. So that's kind of like amazing.
Yeah, that's awesome. Of course, you can multiply yourself. You can downstream tasks, even complicated tasks, and yeah, if you get access to all your research or your digital footprint, essentially. We talk about how great those tools are. Is there all their advantages? Maybe is there a problem, technical problem, which you maybe, you know, people don't don't spend too much time solving it, which would require more attention from the public, that you would say like, okay, is there a certain area you cannot, maybe not specifically, that you think is maybe underdeveloped? Or
I mean, it's not so much a problem, but an opportunity. I mean, I would definitely encourage everybody to try these tools. Like, even if you're not a technical person, like my fiance, she's an accountant, and she started using Lovable to build a kind of web app. And I kind of was encouraging her to move to Claude Code, and she thought it was a bit intimidating because, you know, you have to launch a terminal and you have to install Claude Code and then you have to launch it. But once you launch it, it's just natural language, right? Like, yes, it's a bit scary because it looks like the 1980s, but it's literally just natural language. Like, you can say hello and it will say hello, and you can say, what can I do with you? And it will say, oh, you can do many things, and you can build a web app. And you're like, okay, build me a web app. And then you're like, oh, wow, I've got a web app. And then you're like, I want to be able to put pictures of my family. And it's like, cool, let me just make that feature for you. And then you're like, wow, I uploaded an image, and you don't even necessarily realize or care where it's storing the image. Okay, there's a security issue, you know, GDPR, you know, but like, you know, you can just do these things, right? You know, like, you know, you have an idea like, hey, it'd be really cool if I could, like, I don't know, mix two songs together or whatever, and, you know, it can do that. Or I wish I could, like, you know, have a little UI for this or that. Or I always wanted to build an app. Like, if you have an idea and you've been thinking about hiring an engineer for your whole life, just like give it to Claude to see what it gives you back, you know, play with it. If you want to make a little video game, you can do that. It'll just like, you can make your video game 3D in just one sentence, you know.
Is there a particular thing which is fun that you built with AI, or which agents enabled you to do, that you probably would have otherwise never spent the time doing?
I mean, all of it is very enjoyable. Like, you know, I feel like just, you know, being able to like go from idea to playing with something, like execution, just it's so kind of exciting and entertaining. You know, you think, hey, you know, that would be cool, and you build it, and you're like, maybe maybe it's not as cool as you thought, and you just discard it, or maybe you just ship it. You know, you're just like, well, I'll put it online, maybe someone will find use of it, maybe not. You know, so I think it's like, you know, it's very just like motivating in and itself, even without a specific thing. You know, like, I mean, I was thinking the other day, maybe I should try some game development, you know, because, you know, I mean, effectively it's just code, right? Like, it was something I always thought I would do when I was a child, but then I kind of drifted away from it. But maybe it's time to drift back to it now that it will be fairly trivial to build an Unreal Engine game, you know.
Yeah, definitely. I think that would be super exciting. You know, especially, I would be curious to see how far do you get in trying to build such a game. Of course, you cannot compete with, I'd say, the professional studios, I guess, because the design and things like that, but you could get quite far.
But it's also interesting because, like, I mean, I haven't yet heard any murmurs from the games industry about the impact there, right? So there's been this like escalating cost of game development for the past like 20 years, right? Where, you know, or even longer, if you think about the 30 years, like in the 90s, like, you know, literally 2 guys in a bedroom in the UK was like a studio, you know. Like, in 6 weeks they'd ship like a Sega Mega Drive game, you know. Okay, it was only like a few megabytes, but like they did it, right? And it worked really well. And back then you couldn't even patch things, so they had to make it perfect on launch, you know, because there was no internet for sure, like, connected to consoles. But like, you know, the game development costs kept going up and up and up, and suddenly they were costing millions and tens of millions and hundreds of millions, and game development times were going from like weeks to months to years to decades now. I mean, GTA 6, when's that coming out? Or Half-Life 3, ooh. But, you know, like with these tools, you can develop software so much faster, you know. Like, if you were like, have a game, you know, I was thinking about modding a game. Like, I could download like some old game and say, hey, like, let's make a mod of Quake 3, and just be like, I want to, I don't know, add this feature, that feature. I want to add like a lizard character who has a bite attack and can't shoot guns, and bada bing, bada boom, you've got it. And you could ship this and people can play it. You can, it's just fun nonsense.
Yeah. I just the only thing that I heard about this, of course, I think this also for the podcast, trying to find a game developer would be, I think, exciting to hear their perspective.
Absolutely.
I think it's developing a compelling story for humans for a game. Is still a very difficult thing to do. It's I think that's something which attracts the masses, which finds exciting. Still a very difficult thing to do. It's not just generating one, but the one is kind of difficult. That's what I heard.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if that's the bottleneck. Yeah. I myself built the tool, so I mean, I'm a researcher. I try to be a researcher. Let's put it this way. I try to build a tool very fast, which I drop a hypothesis, and then there's like reasons for that hypothesis grounded in literature and reasons against it, and then a likelihood what is right. So that's what I try to build. I should go back down, and of course with tools with like Exa, essentially knowledge graphs, I think we could definitely improve that, because I'm always like trying to find a nice area for research. This kind of like the cool thing. So like, okay, I don't know too much about the question, could go any way, but what's the understanding of this, and how could this build on? That's what I did very quickly. I was very excited about it. But it definitely enables you to build very fast tools.
One thing I find exceptionally useful here is the idea of being able to build like once-off tools. Like if you have a task that you need to spend some time doing, very likely a tool can like significantly expedite the task, right? Can make it significantly easier to do, make you significantly more productive, even if you are still going to do the task, right? And like in the past, again, you would need like reason to build a tool. You'd need reason to have like 4 engineers spend 6 months building the tool, standing it up, maintaining it for months or whatever. Whereas now you can just like roll your own tool in real time, right? So recently I was doing some diffusion model training to learn more about like image generation, and I had some data to fine tune my model, and I was like, I want to annotate this data, right? First of all, I wanted to annotate it with like descriptions and like highlight certain patches with screenshots and things, and I just quickly like vibe coded a tool to do all this. And then once I had the generations from the model, I wanted to do this DPO, right? This preference optimization. And so what I wanted was, for a given prompt, I would do multiple generations of different seeds, and I wanted to like tag things as like good, bad, right? So effectively when there was like these kind of floating limbs, additional limbs mutating out of people as you get, that was bad. Otherwise it's good, right? But effectively I had like an almost like Tinder-like interface where it was like right, left, right, left, right, left, right, like the good, bad, good, bad, good, bad, good, bad, down if they were like both bad, but just like quickly so suddenly like this task of like annotating like hundreds of generations just became like a very quick like finger flicking exercise for several minutes, right? And again, like that tool was like one use only, you know what I mean? It's probably like thousands of lines of like HTML and JavaScript and whatever, and I have all my annotated things, and then I did my DPO, and suddenly my new model went from like 50% abomination rate to like 5%. I was like, that's nice. That worked. Good experiment,
Very nice. Very, impressive. Yeah. That brings me also a bit to a thought. Maybe the future of, let's say, humans, developers, or, it's about, creating those tools along the way. And then it's basically your selling point about yourself is basically that you had, you have all this large portfolio of tools that you can use, which increase efficiency, and that you thought of, and maybe other people do not do, and that's why you are maybe very efficient at doing certain tasks. Who knows? So you have like your organization of yourself and the agents and your tools, which makes, in the end, gives you the edge.
Yeah. I feel like it's a bit like Inspector Gadget, that you have this like magical like hat that opens up and like a helicopter comes out and you just sort of fly somewhere else, and then you just suddenly have like a little knife comes out your finger and you can just cut something. It's
I like that metaphor a lot. Go Gadget.
Yeah. Go Gadget image classifier, go Gadget this,
I think very, very exciting conversation, Max. I think I learned a lot, certainly, about all the different applications of agents, and and much more about the challenges of Europe, your own perspective. Now to conclude, maybe how can we find out more about you, about Exa? How can we
you can check out exa.ai, where you can You can make a profile. You can like play with our different search products. You can parameterize things and see what you get. You can find me on LinkedIn. I share a lot of stuff there. I'm also on X, but it's relatively new. I don't have very many followers. I also have my own podcast on YouTube called Signal and Stories, where I regularly interview different people from different parts of the AI space on similar topics that we've kind of discussed. But yeah.
Awesome. So please check it out. We'll also make sure we share the links when the episode is out. And yeah, thank you so much to be on the podcast.
Thank you very much.
You're a